There is a jar on the third shelf of this shop that has never been empty. Not in my time here, not in the time of the man who taught me, not, as far as anyone can trace the records, in the time of the man who taught him. The label reads simply, Viola. You may know it better as pansy, or heartsease, or the small face-shaped flower growing in the crack of your garden wall that you have been meaning to pull out for 3 weeks now. Do not pull it out. What you have there is one of the most continuously used medicinal plants in recorded human history. A plant that appears in Chinese medicine, in Native American tradition, in Persian salves, in medieval monastery records, in the herbals of Gerard and Culpeper, and in the pharmacopoeias of every serious European apothecary for the last 2,000 years. A plant that was used for the chest, the skin, the bowel, the bladder, the eye, the heart, and the blood that was made into syrups and ointments and plasters and washes and decoctions, that was given to feverish children and to patients with conditions we still do not fully understand today. A plant that most people walk past without a second glance. Tonight, we are going to give it the second glance it has always deserved. Come in. The door is open. Find somewhere comfortable. The candle is burning and the shop is quiet, and there is nowhere you need to be for a very long time. We have a great deal to cover. And if somewhere along the way you find yourself drifting, that is entirely acceptable. That is, in fact, the point. Now, before we begin properly, if you find yourself enjoying an evening in this shop, a quiet word of encouragement to press the like button below and to subscribe if you have not already done so. It is a small gesture, but it keeps the candle burning and the shelves stocked and this old apothecary open for business. And I would very much like to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Leave it in the comments below. A city, a country, a quiet room with the rain coming down outside. Whatever you care to share. And if there's a plant or a herb or an apothecary ingredient you have been curious about, leave that too. The shelves here are well stocked. There are many jars, many stories, many evenings ahead. Now then, let us begin. Pick up any jar in this shop and turn it slowly in the candlelight. The label tells you what is inside, but sometimes the name on the label tells you something else entirely. Something about the people who named it. Something about what they saw when they looked at a small and overlooked thing and decided it deserved a word. This jar here. Third shelf, near the left, small enough to sit in the palm of one hand. The label reads simply, Viola. You may know it better by another name. Most people do. Pansy, heartsease Johnny Jump Up, the flower that grows at the edge of garden beds and along the cracked stone of old walls, and in the thin margins of places where more deliberate plants are given up. The one you have almost certainly walked past this week without stopping, without once looking down at it properly. That is fitting, in a way, because the name pansy comes from the French pansy. It means thought, the act of holding something gently in the mind, of turning it over, of sitting with it quietly without needing to resolve it into anything more useful than itself. The French chose that word because of the flower's face. Look closely at a pansy and you will see it. The dark lines drawn inward toward the center, the rounded shape of the petals, the slight and unmistakable suggestion of features, eyes, a brow, something that looks back at you with an expression you cannot quite name. People have always seen a face there, the face caught in the middle of some quiet and private consideration, thinking about something. It will not tell you. Something it has been thinking about for a very long time. And so the French called it pansy, the thinker, the one lost in thought. From there it became a flower of remembrance, of being thought of. In some traditions you gave a pansy to someone to tell them they had been in your mind, not a dramatic declaration. Nothing that required ceremony or occasion. Just a small, quiet signal passed from one hand to another. I have been thinking of you. I wanted you to know. It is a gentle thing to give someone Some traditions went further and treated the pansy specifically as a thinking of you flower. Not a flower of love exactly, though love is never far from thought. More a flower of presence, of one person carrying another person with them through their days. The face and the petals looking outward toward whoever was being held in mind. There is something quietly remarkable about a flower whose name is the act of thinking. Most flowers were named for what they looked like, or where they grew, or what they were used for. This one was named for what it made people do, for the particular quality of attention it seemed to invite. You looked at it and it looked back, and something in you slowed down. That has not changed. I have noticed it myself. Many times, over many years behind this counter, someone picks up a sprig of Viola from the preparation bench and holds it for a moment longer than necessary, not examining it, not looking for anything in particular, just looking, the face and the flower looking back. Both of them, briefly, thinking about something. But the French were not alone in naming this flower. Across Europe, people looked at the same petals and saw entirely different things, and what they saw tells you something true about the places they came from, about the stories that lived inside their households and their winters and their particular way of understanding how the world was arranged. In Germany, the pansy became Stiefel, Töchterchen, little stepmother. The story goes like this. The flower has 5 petals. The 2 large upper petals are the stepmother's own daughters, well-dressed, comfortable, seated in the better chairs. The 2 middle petals are the stepdaughters, smaller, less favored. And the single lower petal, the smallest of all, pressed down beneath the others, is the neglected child. The one who sits on the harder seat, the one who is given what is left after everyone else has taken their share. It is a folk tale told to children, and it is not a kind one. But it is honest in the way that old folk tales tend to be honest, not softening what households sometimes contained, not pretending that love was always evenly distributed among the people who were required to share a roof. The flower became a small moral lesson, growing wild in the hedgerow, a reminder, in 5 petals, of something children already understood and adults preferred not to name directly. In Scandinavia and Scotland, the same story traveled under the same name, the stepmother flower, each petal its own character, each one with its place in the household and its share of the story and its particular quality of being seen or not seen by the woman at the center of it all. The Czech name, Masika, follows the same path. Little stepmother, some say the name came specifically from the flower's resemblance to a sullen face. A woman with a particular expression that people in those places recognized and had a name for and apparently felt the need to preserve in the naming of a flower so that it would not be forgotten. Children in those countries grew up with this flower as a story, not just a plant growing in the field, a whole small drama played out in 5 petals every time one came into view, every pansy a household, every petal a person with a history. Then there's Italy, where the same flower became flamola, little flame. Not a face, not a family, not a story of neglect and favoritism and complicated domestic arrangements. A brightness, a warmth, a small fire burning low and steady close to the ground. The Italians looked at the same petals the Germans looked at and saw something entirely different. Not a sullen woman, but a light. Not a household drama, but a warmth that had decided to make itself small and live at the level of the earth. And in Hungary, the flower was called something else again. Small, orphan. I think about that sometimes, standing here in the quiet of the evening with the jars around me and the candle burning low, the same plant, the same 5 petals. And in one country it is a thinker, in another it is a stepmother's cruelty rendered in botanical form, in another it is a little flame, in another it is a child with no one to belong to. What people saw in the flower told you what they were thinking about, what sat at the center of their days and their worries and their stories. The flower did not change. The people looking at it changed, and each of them found in those 5 petals exactly what they had been carrying with them and needed somewhere to put. A plant accumulates names the way an old house accumulates furniture. Each generation adds something. Some pieces fit beautifully and stay for centuries. Some do not fit at all but stay anyway because no one can agree on what to replace them with. Some get handed down with great ceremony, and some are left in corners and forgotten until someone opens the wrong door. But the plant itself remains, patient-rooted, entirely indifferent to what any of us decide to call it. In England, the flower had another name entirely: heartsease. It is a good name, a plain English name that carries its meaning without decoration or apology. Ease of the heart, relief from what burdens the heart. The quiet suggestion that here, in this small and common plant growing at the margins of cultivated ground, there is something that helps. Something that addresses not the body's obvious complaints, but the subtler and harder to name trouble that sits behind the ribs and will not be shifted by reason alone. The flower in question is specifically Viola tricolor. The wild one, 3 colors in the petals, yellow, white, and that particular shade of purple that seems deeper than it has any right to be in something so small, growing in disturbed ground and field edges in the thin soil of old pasture, where nothing more demanding has managed to establish itself. Much smaller than the garden pansy most people picture when they hear the word, but the same family, the same quiet expression, looking up from the ground at whoever happens to be passing. People carry the name heartsease because the plant had been used for what the heart holds, for grief and anxiety, and the kind of persistent low feeling that arrives without a single clear cause and will not be argued away. The old doctrine of signatures played a part in this thinking. The belief that a plant's appearance could point toward its purpose, that the shape or color or character of a thing in the natural world was not accidental but instructive, a kind of language written into the plant itself for those who knew how to read it. A flower with a face that looked thoughtful and gentle was good for the mind. A flower that eased the eye might ease the heart. That thinking has its limits, I am aware of that. We want the chemistry now, we want the compound identified and the mechanism explained and the trial conducted under controlled conditions with the results written up and reviewed, and those things have their value. Considerable value, but the people who named this flower heartsease were not foolish. They were not inventing things from nothing. They were observing carefully over long periods of time what happened when people used the plant, and often, not always, but often enough to matter, what they watched was someone feeling better. Whether the flower was the direct cause of that improvement, or whether it worked through the ritual of being attended to, or through the simple fact of someone handing you a remedy and sitting with you while you took it, they could not have told you, and perhaps they did not need to. The name stuck regardless. It is still used now. The plant is still in this jar, and people still ask for it. Sometimes in exactly the same terms their great-grandmothers would have used. Johnny Jump Up is the other name, an American one. Mostly, though, the habit it describes is universal. It refers to the plant's way of appearing where you did not put it. Viola seeds scatter freely and germinate with enthusiasm in ground that has been disturbed or left alone or simply ignored long enough to suit them. They jump up in the corners of garden beds where something else used to grow. They appear in the cracks between paving stones. They establish themselves along the bases of walls and in the thin margins of paths and in all the small overlooked territories that more demanding plants have decided are beneath their attention. There is affection in that name, a slight smile behind it, the plant that shows up uninvited and makes itself entirely at home when you find, when you notice it, that you are glad it came, that the corner is better for its presence, that something you did not plan has turned out to be exactly what was needed. That quality is real. I have seen it in this garden, and in every garden I have had occasion to observe over the years. Violas find the edges. They grow in the places that careful gardening forgot to include in its arrangements, and they flower there reliably, season after season, as if they had been planned all along by someone with better taste than the gardener. An apothecary notices these things. A plant that persists without assistance is a plant that has decided to be here. That tells you something about its constitution, about a certain quality of endurance that is written into the plant as surely as the face is written into the petals. And a plant with that kind of constitution, that quiet, undemonstrative determination to simply continue, is almost always worth paying close attention to. I have had Viola in this shop for a long time. Longer than I sometimes remember precisely. It arrived early. In the years when I was still learning what belonged here and what did not, it made itself useful quickly. And it is still here now, on the third shelf, in a jar that fits neatly in one hand, a label written in my father's hand on the older jars and in mine on the newer ones. A small continuity, a quiet persistence of its own. The name on that label is simple, but the names behind the name go back a long way, through France and Germany and Bohemia and Italy and Hungary and the English fields and the American gardens, where someone looked down one spring morning and noticed a small flower that had appeared overnight in a corner. They had not prepared for it, and gave it a name that carried a smile in it, and moved on about their day. That is not a short history for something that grows in the cracks of garden walls. It never is. The Greeks had a story for everything. That is not a criticism. It is an observation about a people who looked at the world around them and refused to accept that anything in it had arrived without a reason. Every plant, every stone, every shift in the weather, everything had come from somewhere, everything had been caused by someone, and the gods, having so much time and so little restraint, had caused a great deal. The pansy had 2 stories, possibly more. Stories of this kind tend to multiply around flowers that people love, each generation adding a version that suits them better than the last. But the ones that survived long enough to be written down share a common thread. They both involve Zeus, which should surprise no one. In the first story, Zeus fell in love with a woman named Io. This was not unusual for Zeus. What was unusual, or at least what the story chooses to emphasize, was what happened afterward. Hera, who had considerable experience with her husband's enthusiasms, discovered the situation, and Zeus, in the particular kind of panic that gods apparently experience when caught by their wives, transformed Io into a white heifer to conceal her. This did not fool Hera. It rarely did. Io found herself grazing in fields in the form of a cow, eating grass, which was not what she had expected her life to contain. And Zeus, watching this, felt something, pity, the story says, or perhaps guilt, though the stories about Zeus are rarely generous enough to grant him guilt. He caused flowers to spring from the earth beneath her feet, sweet flowers in purple and yellow and white, scattered across the grass where she walked, something better to eat than plain meadow grass, something worthy of her, something that acknowledged, at least, that this situation was not entirely her fault. Those flowers were called Io, named for her. The woman who had been transformed into something she was not and left to make the best of it in a field somewhere, while the gods sorted out their domestic arrangements. It is, if you look at it squarely, not a particularly flattering origin story for the flower. A woman wronged, transformed, consoled with something pretty to eat, and yet the flower carries her name through it. Io, the one who endured, the one the earth made beautiful things for, even in difficult circumstances. I have always found something in that worth keeping. The second story involves Cupid, or Eros, depending on which tradition you are following, and is somewhat less complicated in its domestic arrangements. In this version, all pansies were once white, pure white, every one of them, without the purple and the yellow and the dark radiating lines that give the modern flower its face. Eros loved them, adored them, the story says, in the particular way that gods adore things they have not yet ruined. He would visit them and admire them, and they were perfect and white and entirely themselves. Then Aphrodite saw that he loved them, and Aphrodite, being who she was, could not leave well enough alone. Out of jealousy of a flower, which gives you some sense of the temperament involved, she changed them. She gave them their colors, the purple, the yellow, the tricolor face. She altered them, the story says, so that they would no longer be purely the thing that Eros loved. What the story does not quite account for is that the altered flower is, by most measures, more beautiful than the plain white one it describes. The face that appeared in the petals, the depth of color, the dark lines drawing the eye inward. These are not a diminishment. They are what the flower is. What it became when someone with that kind of power decided to change it. Whether that was Aphrodite's intention is another question entirely. There's a third version, or rather a variation, that found its way into Roman tradition, and from there into the broader current of European thought about this flower. In this telling, it is Cupid's arrow that is responsible. The arrow, the one that causes love, that strikes without warning and changes everything it touches, went astray. It struck a pansy instead of its intended target. And the pansy, struck by that arrow, became infused with love potion properties, with the power to cause what the arrow was meant to cause, with something of Eros or Cupid in it depending on the tradition, something of that unasked for and irresistible force that love was understood to be in the ancient world. The Romans connected this to Venus, the arrow of her sun, the flower of her domain. And from that connection came the long association between pansies and love magic, between the flower and the particular category of remedy or ritual that was meant to produce or intensify affection in someone who had not yet felt it, or had felt it and let it cool, or had simply not noticed the person standing in front of them who very much wished to be noticed. Love potions made with pansy appear across Roman and Greek tradition, not as curiosities, not as the marginal practices of people who did not know better, as things people actually used or believed they used or wanted to believe they used. Because the alternative, that love arrives and departs without any mechanism you can influence, was then, as now, not a comfortable thing to accept. The flower was part of that hope. The small purple and yellow face struck by the arrow, that causes love, carried in a pocket or slipped into food or brewed into something, and given to someone at the right moment. Whether it worked is a question I am not equipped to answer definitively. What I can tell you is that people believed, and belief, in matters of the heart especially, is not nothing. It is not nothing at all. The Greeks had one more relationship with the violet worth knowing about. Not myth this time, something more civic, more particular to one city and its sense of itself. Athens wore violet wreaths. In classical antiquity, the Athenians crowned themselves with violets as a symbol of their city. Not laurel, which belonged to Apollo, and to victors and to the business of being admired, violets. The small purple flowers that grew in the fields, and along roadsides and in the kind of ordinary ground that cities are always pushing back against. The Athenians chose that for themselves, made it their own, wore it in garlands as a declaration of civic identity. Why violet specifically is not entirely clear from what the records give us. Perhaps the color, purple, had its associations with dignity, with something valued, with the particular gravity of a city that considered itself the center of a great deal that mattered. Perhaps the scent, which in Viola odorata is extraordinary, and was certainly known to the Greeks. Perhaps simply the abundance of them in the landscape around the city, so that the flower became synonymous with the place in the way that particular plants sometimes do. Whatever the reason, the Greeks and Romans both cultivated violets with serious intent, not only as decorative things, though they were certainly that. For perfumes, the scent of violet was prized and extracted and used in preparations that were traded across considerable distances. For confections, the flowers themselves preserved in sugar or honey, eaten as something between a food and a luxury, the kind of thing that sits at the edge of medicine and pleasure and refuses to commit entirely to either category. An apothecary understands that position. Well, the best remedies have always been the ones that do not feel entirely like remedies, the ones that are pleasant enough that the person taking them does not need to be convinced. The violet, sweet-scented and sweet-tasting, and carrying in its petals the accumulated weight of stories about love and transformation and divine attention, that was never going to be a hard sell. It has not become one since Shakespeare knew his plants. This is not a small thing to say. The man wrote in a world where botanical knowledge was not a specialist pursuit confined to apothecaries and physicians. It was general, it was the kind of thing educated people knew and expected other educated people to know. When he put a plant into a scene, his audience understood what he was doing with it, They knew the associations. They knew the history. They did not need a footnote. And he chose this flower more than once. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the love potion that drives half the play's chaos comes from a flower called Love in Idleness. A pansy-like flower, the one that Oberon instructs Puck to fetch from a particular western bank where it grows in the dark. The flower that, when its juice is applied to sleeping eyelids, causes the sleeper to fall in love with whatever they first see upon waking. Titania wakes to a man with the head of a donkey and finds him irresistible. The Athenian lovers stumble through the enchanted forest, pursuing the wrong people with the wrong intensity at the wrong hours of the night. All of it from a flower. Shakespeare did not invent this association. That is important to understand. He was writing for an audience that already knew about pansies and love and the old Roman stories of Cupid's misdirected arrow. He was drawing on something that was already in the room when he began. The love in idleness of the play is continuous with everything that had come before it. The Greek myths, the Roman love potions, the long tradition of this particular flower as something that crossed the boundary between ordinary experience and the kind of experience that cannot quite be explained by ordinary means. What Shakespeare did was lock it into Western literary memory in a way that nothing before had quite managed. Once a thing appears in that particular set of plays, in language with that particular quality of sticking in the mind, it tends to stay there. Love in idleness, the flower that causes love when it should not. The flower that makes people feel things they did not intend to feel and cannot govern once they have begun. It is still in the room. It will be for a long time yet. The other appearance is quieter, more painful. In Hamlet, Ophelia comes to the court in a state that the play handles with great delicacy and considerable sadness, distributing flowers to the people around her. Each flower carrying its meaning, each one a communication she cannot make in plain speech anymore, or perhaps a communication that plain speech would not be adequate to carry. She gives out pansies, and she says, simply, there is pansies. That is for thoughts. 4 words of explanation that needed no further explanation in that room or in any room where the play was performed. The audience knew, the characters knew the flower was for thoughts, for remembrance, for the carrying of someone in your mind after they are no longer where they used to be. Her father has just died. The person she is thinking of is gone, and she hands someone a pansy and tells them what it means. And the meaning is centuries old and perfectly chosen, and unbearably sad in the particular way that perfectly chosen things can be when the situation around them is beyond remedy. She also says, later in the same scene, that she would have brought violets, but that they all withered when her father died. The violet, in this moment, is faithfulness, fidelity, the quality of remaining constant. And she is telling whoever she is speaking to that faithfulness has gone out of the world since her father left it, that the flowers that represented it could not survive his absence, that the withering of the violets is not a botanical observation, but a statement about what has been lost. Laertes, her brother, uses the same flower in a different register, comparing Hamlet's love for his sister to a violet, quick to bloom, lovely while it lasts, and quick to die, something seasonal, something that cannot be trusted to remain. The violet in his mouth is not a comfort, but a warning, a way of saying that what looks like devotion in the spring of a young man's life is not necessarily what it presents itself as being. 3 uses of the same flower in the same play, 3 different meanings, all consistent with the centuries of meaning that had accumulated around it before Shakespeare ever sat down to write. The thinker's flower, the faithfulness flower, the love that does not last. All of it held in the petals of a plant that grew in every hedgerow and every garden and every field margin in England, and had been doing so for longer than anyone could remember. Shakespeare's world was still connected to older ways of understanding plants. The boundary between medicine and magic and fairy tale was not as firm in his time as we sometimes imagine. Physicians and herbalists were well acquainted with the pansy and its uses, and the pansy was equally well acquainted with beliefs that predate the herbalists by a considerable margin. The Celts and the Druids had known this flower. They had linked it to nature spirits and to the beings that inhabited the margins of the human world, the places where the cultivated ground gave way to something older and less managed. Fairies, in the older European understanding, were not the small decorative creatures that later centuries made of them. They were something more ambiguous, something that required careful handling, something that could take offense. And pansies, growing as they do in disturbed ground and field margins and the edges of things, growing in exactly the kind of territory that was understood to belong partly to the human world and partly to whatever lay alongside it. Pansies had fairy associations that went back a long way, that were present in medieval folklore and in early modern folklore, and that Shakespeare's audience would have recognized alongside the more literary and classical meanings. Some traditions held that you should be careful picking pansies, that the fairies could take offense at careless harvesting, that the flower had protections around it that were not visible but were nonetheless real. This was not universal. Not every tradition attached that particular warning to the plant, but it recurred often enough to be part of what the flower meant in popular understanding. A small requirement of attention, of acknowledging that the thing you were taking from the ground had not been put there entirely for your convenience. An apothecary learns something like that, eventually. If they pay attention long enough, the plants in these jars were not manufactured. They were grown, they were part of something larger than the use I am putting them to. The courtesy of noticing that is not superstition. It is simply accuracy. What strikes me, standing here with this jar in the evening quiet, is how completely the Viola moved through all of these registers without contradiction. Medicine and love magic and garden symbolism, and fairy lore and the most celebrated playwright in the English language, the flower passed through all of it and remained itself throughout. Did not become only one thing, did not get fixed in place by any single meaning. It was the thinker's flower, and the love potion flower, and the faithfulness flower, and the fairy flower, and the heartsease flower, and the apothecary's flower, all at once, without any of those meanings cancelling out any of the others. That is a particular kind of richness, not the richness of a thing that has been polished until it reflects only one light. The richness of something that has been genuinely useful to a great many different people in a great many different ways over a very long period of time, and has simply absorbed all of it. The jar on the shelf holds dried viola, a plain label. My father's handwriting on the older jars, my own on the newer. Nothing about Oberon, nothing about Ophelia, nothing about the fairies in the field margins or the druidic associations or the love potions of Rome. But all of that is in there nonetheless. Everything a plant has meant to everyone who ever looked at it carefully enough to give it a name is in there. Compressed into dried petals and stems in a ceramic jar, on a shelf, in an apothecary shop, on a quiet evening. It always is. The veins of a pansy petal are not subtle things. Hold one up to the light, and I mean truly hold it, not glance at it and move on. But hold it still and look at it with the kind of attention the flower has always invited. And you will see them clearly, dark lines radiating inward from the edge, branching, dividing, meeting at the center in a pattern that is never quite the same from one flower to the next, never quite the same from one petal to the next on the same flower. People have always found patterns irresistible, especially patterns that vary. A pattern that is always identical tells you nothing, a pattern that shifts and changes and presents itself differently each time you look. That is a pattern that seems to be saying something, seems to be responding to something, seems to know what you brought with you when you came to look at it. And so the pansy became a divination tool. The tradition that attached itself to this practice in later folklore was Arthurian, which is to say it gathered around itself the particular atmosphere of Arthurian legend. The knights, the quests, the world of chivalric honor and courtly love, and the sense that the right reading of the right sign at the right moment could tell you something true about what was coming. Later folklore, not history. The stories had been accumulating and elaborating for centuries by the time they attached themselves to this particular use of this particular flower. But the attachment held The pansy and the knights and the reading of petals found each other and stayed together in the popular imagination long enough. The practice itself was specific. A knight, or whoever was doing the asking, would pluck a pansy and examine the veins of its petals with careful attention. 4 lines radiating cleanly outward signaled hope. That was a good reading. That was the petal telling you that what you were hoping for had some ground beneath it, that the future was not closed against you. Thick lines leaning to the left meant trouble ahead. A warning, the flower's small cartography, pointing toward difficulty, rather than toward the clear road you might have preferred. Other configurations spoke to love and to victory, to the 2 great preoccupations of the tradition in which this practice was embedded, whether the person asking would win what they were fighting for, whether the person they loved would return that love. The oldest questions, the ones people have always wanted some indication about, some small advance signal from the world that the thing they wanted was actually possible. I do not offer divination services from this counter. That is not what this shop is for, but I do not dismiss the practice either, because what it describes is something real, even if the mechanism it proposes is not. The attention it required was real. The act of sitting with a flower and looking at it carefully and thinking seriously about what you wanted and what you feared, that was real, whatever the veins of the petal could or could not tell you about the future. The practice of stopping and looking and asking the question clearly was not nothing. There is a reason this flower accumulated these associations rather than some other flower. The veins are genuinely there, the variation is genuinely present. And the face in the petals, that quality of being looked back at, of the flower seeming to have an expression, an interiority, a kind of attention of its own that invites exactly this kind of use. You look at it and it looks at you, and in that exchange something opens up that is harder to access in the ordinary run of the day. Whether what opens up is a window onto the future, or simply a window onto yourself, is a question I will leave for others to settle. The flower does not seem particularly concerned either way. There is something this flower used to have that it no longer has, or so the story goes, a German folk tale. And German folk tales tend toward a particular quality of moral seriousness, a sense that things happen for reasons and that the reasons are instructive, tells that the pansy once had a strong and beautiful scent, not the faint sweetness of the wild violet, which is real and present and extraordinary in Viola odorata, but something more pronounced, something that carried, something that made the fields where it grew fragrant in a way that people noticed and valued and came to expect. The trouble was the cattle. The scent drew people into the fields to smell the flowers, and people walking through fields where cattle grazed caused the cattle to be disturbed, driven back, unable to graze properly in the ground they needed. The fields were being loved to a kind of inconvenience. The flower's gift was causing a problem it had not intended and could not have anticipated. And so the pansy surrendered its scent. Not had it taken, not lost it through neglect or through some failure of the plant's own constitution, surrendered it, made a choice in the way that things in folk tales make choices, simply, completely, without complaint. The scent went, the cattle grazed undisturbed, the fields returned to their proper use, and the pansy kept its face and its colors and its centuries of accumulated meaning, and gave up only the one thing that was causing harm by being too good. I find that a remarkable story to attach to a flower. Most origin stories of this kind explain a loss as punishment or accident. This one explains it as sacrifice, a voluntary diminishment for the sake of something larger than the flower's own appeal. There is a quality in that which goes beyond explanation and into the territory of moral instruction, which is, of course, exactly where German folk tales tend to be heading all along. Whether you take it literally or not, the story preserves something true. The pansy does not have the scent you might expect it to have. You look at it, and the face and the colors suggest something fragrant, and then you lean in and find not nothing exactly, but very little. A faint greenness, a suggestion, the ghost of a scent rather than the thing itself. The story gives that absence a reason, and a reason with a moral in it, that The wild violet is different. Viola dorata earns its name, but the pansy Viola tricolor surrendered what its cousin kept. The folk tale knows this and explains it in the only terms that make a thing feel properly accounted for, the terms of intention and choice and something quietly noble done without fanfare. Christianity found this flower early and found several things in it worth keeping. The most enduring was the Trinity. Viola tricolor has 3 colors in its petals, purple, white, and yellow, arranged in a pattern that the medieval eye read as intentional, as communicative, as a plant that had been made to carry a theological meaning in its very appearance. The monks called it herba trinitatis, herb of the Trinity, 3 colors for 3 persons, a botanical expression of a central mystery of the faith, growing in the fields and roadsides where anyone could find it, available to anyone who had eyes to see what it was saying. This was the doctrine of signatures, operating inside a Christian framework. The same instinct that had made healers read a plant's appearance as a guide to its use was here, reading a plant's appearance as a guide to its meaning. The flower was not merely decorative, it was instructive. It was placed in the world with intention, and the intention was legible to those who looked carefully enough. Herb Trinity. The name survived. It is still used in some traditions, a small piece of theological language embedded in the common name of a wildflower that grows in thin soil at the edges of fields. The 3 colors also gathered their own individual meanings over time. Purple for memories, white for loving thoughts, yellow for souvenirs, the small kept things, the material remnants of what has passed. 3 colors, 3 kinds of holding on, 3 ways of keeping something present that is no longer physically here, which brings the flower back by a different route to pansy, to thought, to the act of carrying someone with you after they are gone. The violet had its own Christian story, a humbler one. In the literal sense of the word, medieval law held that the violet, which grows low and close to the ground, and keeps its face turned downward in the characteristic way of Viola odorata, had bowed its head in shame when the shadow of the cross fell over it, that it had lowered itself in the presence of that particular moment and had never raised itself again, that the downward angle of the flower was not an accident of botany, but a posture of permanent reverence. And so the violet became the flower of humility, of humble modesty, in the specific Christian understanding of that quality, not the false modesty of refusing compliments, but the genuine orientation of a creature that knows its own smallness in relation to something infinitely larger, and holds that knowledge quietly without making a performance of it. Some traditions said violets sprang up on the graves of virgins and of saints, that the plant had an affinity for holiness, that it sought out the places where exceptional lives had ended, and made something beautiful there, as a kind of acknowledgement, as the earth's own small gesture of recognition. Medieval Christians used the bowed violet in healing rites connected to these associations. The humility symbolism was not merely decorative. It was functional in the way that symbolism is functional inside a religious framework. It oriented the healing practice. It placed what was being done within a larger understanding of what the body was and what it was for and what it owed to what was above it. The flower moved easily through all of this, the pagan associations and the Christian ones, the love magic of Rome and the Trinity symbolism of the monks, the fairy lore of the Celtic tradition and the humility symbolism of the church. It carried all of it without strain, without any of it seeming to contradict any of the rest. That is the particular gift of a plant that people have loved for long enough. It becomes large enough to hold everything they have brought to it. This one has had a very long time to become that large. The cloister garden was not an accident. Nothing in a medieval monastery was an accident. The placement of every plant, the arrangement of every bed, the choice of what grew where, and alongside what, all of it considered, all of it intentional. The monks who designed and maintained those gardens were working within a framework in which the physical world was understood to be legible, to be meaningful, to be arranged according to principles that careful attention could reveal. A garden was not merely a productive space, it was a kind of argument, a statement about order and purpose, and the relationship between the human and the divine. And in those gardens, violets grew in the cloister walk, in the contemplative spaces, in the areas designed specifically for the kind of slow, repeated, meditative movement that monastic life built into its daily structure, the walking and the thinking and the praying that happened in the sheltered passages around the central green. The violet was there not because it was useful, though it was useful. It was there because of what it meant, because of the humility symbolism that had attached itself to the flower and made it the right plant for a space dedicated to a particular kind of interior life. It symbolized Mary's humility. The downward-facing flower, the plant that kept close to the ground, the thing that did not raise itself up or make itself conspicuous, but simply continued, season after season, in the same posture of quiet orientation toward what was larger than itself. In the cloister walk, where monks moved through their daily offices, with their own eyes often cast downward and their attention turned inward, the violet was companionable. It understood the posture. It had been holding it for a long time. In the knot gardens, those elaborate formal plantings of the medieval period, where low-growing plants were arranged into interlocking geometric patterns that could be read from above as a kind of living embroidery, violets appeared again, chosen specifically for their low growth, for the way they stayed close to the earth and did not interrupt the pattern by growing above it. A plant that knew its place in the design and kept it. Albertus Magnus, the 13th century scholar who wrote on everything from theology to natural philosophy to the practical matter of how to make a garden that was worth spending time, enlisted the sweet violet among the flowers of paradise. Among the plants that belonged in a medieval pleasure garden alongside the lily and the rose, the great company of significant flowers, the ones that carried enough weight of meaning and beauty to justify their place in a space designed for something more than mere utility. The lily for purity, the rose for love and for the virgin, and the violet for humility, for contemplation, for the quality of attention that the pleasure garden was meant to cultivate in the person walking through it. These were not decorative choices made on the basis of color. They were theological choices made on the basis of what the person in the garden was supposed to be thinking about while they walked. The violet had been in English gardens long before the Norman period formalized things. The Celts had used it. The early Britons had incorporated it into salves and beauty preparations. Lotions made from the leaves and flowers that were applied to the skin, with the understanding that the plant had something to offer beyond what you could eat or drink. They had made tea like preparations from the leaves. Simple infusions, the plant steeped in hot water and drunk. An old practice, older than the monasteries by a considerable margin. The 10th century English herbals added another quality to the flower's growing reputation. They claimed that violets repelled evil spirits, that the plant, grown or carried or used in certain ways, provided a kind of protection against the category of harm that came not from illness or injury or ordinary bad fortune, but from something more willful, something with intention behind it, the violet as a ward, as a boundary between the person who held it and whatever was abroad in the world that wished them ill. This sits alongside the fairy associations without contradiction. In the older understanding of these things, the boundary between evil spirits and fairy beings who could take offense was not always a firm one. The plant that required careful handling, because it belonged partly to the fairy world, was also the plant that could protect you from the things that moved in the dark margins of the world. Both traditions placed the violet at the threshold, between the safe and the unsafe, between the known and the not quite known. An apothecary who has spent enough years behind this counter develops a respect for thresholds, for the places where one category of understanding meets another, and neither is quite sufficient on its own. The violet has always lived in those places. That is part of what makes it interesting to think about on a quiet evening with the candles burning low. In France, the troubadours had their own relationship with the flower, the great poetry contests of the medieval period. Those elaborate competitions of verse and music and courtly expression that the southern French took very seriously indeed, awarded violets as prizes. The best poem won violets. The finest verse earned the flower of thought and remembrance, Whether the choice was symbolic or simply practical or both at once, the gesture made a particular kind of sense. A flower that meant thought, given to the person who had thought most beautifully, a flower of contemplation, given to the person whose contemplation had produced something. The troubadours were singing largely about love, about devotion, and longing and the complicated emotional territory of courtly feeling, and the pansy, the flower of thought and of being thought of. That was exactly the right flower to place in the hands of the person who had described those things most precisely, most honestly, most in the way that made other people recognize something they had felt but not yet found words for. In Germany, the arrival of the first violets of spring was marked, not merely noticed, marked, celebrated. German folk dancers incorporated the first spring violets into pre-modern seasonal celebrations. The flower that came earliest, that pushed through the cold at the very beginning of the year's warmth, was significant enough to be honored in the body's movement, in the communal gesture of dance, in the acknowledgement that something worth acknowledging had returned. That instinct is very old, older than any of the specific traditions that expressed it. The first flower of spring is never just a flower. It is evidence, proof that the cold did not win, that the ground is still capable of producing what it produced before, that the cycle has turned again and can be trusted to continue turning. The viola, blooming early, was that evidence in a great many places across a great many centuries. In America, where the plant had arrived with the settlers and made itself entirely at home, the children found their own uses for it. Young settlers made pansy dolls, arranging the flower faces into paper figures, using the face and the petals as a face for something built around it, giving the flower's expression a body, extending the thing that was already there into something you could hold and move and play with. There was also the Violet War, a folk game popular in the 19th and early 20th century, in which two players intertwined the stems of pansies and pulled them apart like wishbones, each trying to keep their stem intact while breaking the other. The flower that children picked from gardens and roadsides and vacant lots and turned into a game of contest and luck, and the particular pleasure of a clean snap at exactly the right moment. Generations of American children played this game with a flower that had crossed an ocean in a settler's pocket and spread across a continent, and found its way into the hands of children who knew nothing about the Greek myths or the troubadour prizes or the cloister gardens or the doctrine of the Trinity written in 3 colors. They just knew the flower was there, that it was good for something, that it had stems that interlocked in a satisfying way and broke cleanly when pulled with the right tension. The pioneers had one more belief about the violet worth recording, a practical one, in the way that pioneer beliefs tended to be practical even when they were also superstitious. A handful of violets brought into the farmhouse in spring ensured prosperity for the season ahead. This was not merely nice to do. This was a ceremony, and neglecting the ceremony had consequences, specifically harm to baby chicks and ducklings, to the small and vulnerable new lives that spring produced and that the farm depended on. The flower that had symbolized Mary's humility in the cloister walk and earned the troubadour his prize and been named Little Flame by the Italians and Little Orphan by the Hungarians and Pansy by the French. That same flower, carried across an ocean and a continent, had become the thing you brought inside in spring to protect your chickens. That is not a diminishment. That is a plant making itself useful to whoever needed it most, in exactly the terms those people understood and valued in the language of their particular lives. It has always done that. In every place it has arrived, in every hand that has picked it up and decided it meant something, it always has. The Victorians did not invent the language of flowers. They inherited it, systematized it, published it in small gilt, edged volumes that sold extremely well, and carried it into the daily life of a society that had strong feelings about what could and could not be said aloud in polite company. The feelings were there, the language existed. What the Victorian period did was give people a code book, a shared reference, a way of being precise about what a particular flower, in a particular color, carried to a particular person meant. so that when it arrived, the meaning could be read correctly, and nothing important would be lost in the gap between intention and understanding. The pansy meant you occupy my thoughts, which is pansy, again, which is the French word that had been attached to this flower for centuries already. The Victorians did not invent this meaning. They confirmed it, wrote it down in the code book, and assigned it its place in the system. And then they refined it further, because the Victorians were nothing if not thorough in their refinements. Purple pansies meant love, and you occupy my thoughts. The two things together, indivisible, the purple carrying both the depth of feeling and the constancy of attention. White pansies represented pure love, the version of love that was uncomplicated by ambivalence or history or the ordinary friction of two people sharing a life. And yellow pansies signaled a desire to be remembered, a request rather than a declaration. Not I am thinking of you, but please think of me. Please carry me with you when I am not there. These were carried in tussie, musses, small, tightly arranged bouquets, held in the hand, or tucked into a bodice, or presented at a doorstep. Each flower chosen with care and placed in deliberate relation to the others. A coded message in botanical form. A communication that could pass between people in a room full of other people and be understood only by the one it was intended for. The tussie-mussie was not a Victorian invention either. The practice was old. What the Victorian period did was make it fashionable again, and fashionable in a particular and rather elaborate way that suited a society that had made an art form of indirect communication, of saying the necessary thing through the available means when the direct means were not available. Henry David Thoreau, not a man typically associated with the elaborations of Victorian social ritual, made a tussie-mussie in 1837, violets and sorrel, tied with straw, his poem wrapped around the flowers. The whole thing tossed through a friend's window, which is a delivery method with a certain directness to it that the more formal Victorian practitioners of the art might have found slightly alarming, but the instinct was the same, the flowers carrying what the plain letter might not carry alone, the scent and the color and the weight of accumulated meaning adding something to the words that the words could not quite add to themselves. The pansy moved into Victorian jewellery, into decorative design, into the embroidered surfaces of domestic life, cushions and handkerchiefs and the borders of things. The face and the flower translated well into the design vocabulary of the period. It had a quality that reproduced satisfyingly in enamel and gold, and the kind of precise needlework that Victorian women spent considerable hours producing. The flower that looked back at you looked back just as attentively from a brooch as from a garden bed. Perhaps more so, a brooch does not close at night. The sweet violet scent came into particular fashion in the late Victorian period. Viola odorata, the scented one, the one that had kept what the pansy gave up in the German folk tale, became fashionable in perfumery and in the small personal preparations that a well-appointed Victorian household maintained. The scent was understood to be refined, delicate without being faint, present without being insistent. The kind of scent that announced itself gently and then remained, which suited perfectly a period that valued exactly that quality of presence in a great many things. The violet was also a flower of the dead, of mourning, of the long practice of placing flowers at graves and carrying them to churchyards and using them in the rituals that surrounded death and the management of grief. In rural England, violets were thrown into graves for remembrance. The same logic that had made them the flower of thought and of being thought of made them appropriate at the moment of final parting. You threw the flower in because you wanted the dead to know they were in your mind, because you needed the gesture of it, because standing at a graveside with nothing in your hands felt inadequate to the weight of the occasion. Mourners also carried violets to protect themselves against what they called cemetery exhalations, the airs of the churchyard, the belief that the air around the dead carried something that could harm the living, something that the scent of the violet could counteract or ward against. The flower that repelled evil spirits in the 10th century English herbals was still in a different register and a different century, serving a protective function for the people who carried it into difficult places. The belief life, and the practice had changed their clothing. The theological framework had shifted, but the underlying gesture, the violet held between the living person and whatever they feared, remained continuous with everything that had come before it. In Australia and New Zealand, the violet did something that most people now associate entirely with another flower. It preceded the poppy as a flower of remembrance for the war dead. In 1915, the same year as Gallipoli, the same year that a generation of young men from those countries went into a war that many of them did not come back from, Adelaide designated a Violet Day. The 2nd of July 1915, a day for the violet to be worn and sold and carried in exactly the way the poppy would later be worn and sold and carried. A flower of mourning and of remembrance, of thinking of carrying the lost with you through an ordinary day in the deliberate and public way that grief sometimes needs to be expressed. The poppy took over. The poppy has its own history and its own weight, and it held the field in the end. But for a moment, in those southern hemisphere cities in the first year of that war, it was the violet, the pansy. The flower that had always meant you are in my thoughts, now pressed into the service of the most devastating kind of remembrance, the kind where the person being thought of is not coming back. That is a long way from the cloister garden, from the troubadour's prize, from the children playing Violet War in American gardens. And it is also a perfectly straight line from pensandi, from the French word, from the face and the petals that people had always seen looking back at them, with an expression of quiet and private consideration. Thinking about something, it will not tell you something it has been thinking about for a very long time. There are plants in this shop that have been touched by powerful people. Not literally, not the dried material in these jars specifically, but the plant itself, the species, the thing the jar contains, has passed through the hands of people whose lives were large enough to leave a mark on everything around them, including the flowers they chose to carry, including the flowers they chose to love. Josephine Bonaparte wore violets on her wedding day in 1796. Sweet violets, Viola odorata, the scented one, the one that had been in cloister gardens and plague posies in the hands of mourners in English churchyards, and the prize bouquets of French troubadours. She wore them on the day she married a man who was already becoming something the world had not quite seen before, and would spend the next 2 decades trying to contain. And she asked him to bring her violets every year on their anniversary, wherever he was, whatever he was doing, whatever campaign or negotiation or crisis was consuming him at the time. He did it. Every year, a bouquet of sweet violets sent to Josephine from wherever Napoleon happened to be in the world at the time of their anniversary. From Italy, from Egypt, from the various points across Europe that his campaigns carried him to, and that the maps of the period covered in the particular red that indicated French advancement. The violets went with him, or rather they were found and sent from wherever he was, and they arrived, and Josephine received them. That is not a small thing to maintain across the kind of life. Napoleon was living. It required intention. It required someone, him, or someone acting on his instruction, to remember in the middle of whatever enormous and violent business was at hand, that there was a woman in Paris who wanted violets, that the anniversary was coming, that the flowers needed to be found and arranged and sent. He remembered. Every year, Josephine died in 1814 before the final defeat. Before Elba, before St. Helena, she died at Malmaison, the house whose gardens she had spent years and considerable sums of money making into something extraordinary. Napoleon was in exile when she died and could not come. When he was finally permitted to visit Malmaison, he walked into her garden and he picked violets from it, from the garden she had made, from the ground where she had walked and tended and arranged the world around her into something beautiful. He pressed them, and he put them in a locket, and he wore that locket until he died. That is the private story, the one between two people and a flower, and the particular quality of grief that attaches itself to the small and ordinary things. The garden, the locket, the dried petals, worn against the chest of a man who had reorganized the map of Europe and could not reorganize his way out of losing her. The public story is something else entirely. Napoleon's supporters, the Bonapartists, the people who remained loyal to him through exile and defeat and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, adopted the violet as their secret emblem, not publicly, not in a way that could be directly observed or prosecuted secretly, the way that loyalty operates. When loyalty has become dangerous, they wore violets to identify each other. A violet in a buttonhole, a violet carried in a particular way. The small signal that said to another person in a room full of people, "I am one of yours. I have not changed. I am still here." Napoleon was given a name among them, Corporal Violet, or in French, Le Pisseur de la Violette, the father of the violet. There was a particular meaning folded into this, the violet that returns with spring, the flower that disappears in winter and comes back, the thing that cannot be permanently removed, only temporarily displaced, that will return when the conditions are right, as it always has, as it always does. It was a message written in a flower name. He will come back. He is the thing that returns. Wait for the violet, and you will understand when he escaped from Elba in 1815 and returned to France. The 100 days, the brief and extraordinary return before Waterloo, ended everything. Finally, crowds of women came out to meet him wearing violets, carrying them, holding them up. The flower that had been the secret signal of loyalty through the years of exile now carried openly in the streets. The secret became public again. The violet as a declaration rather than a whisper. He was defeated at Waterloo that same year. Exiled again, this time to St. Helena, which was considerably further from France than Elba and considerably less easy to escape from. The authorities, having learned something from the violet episode, made their response proportionate to what the flower had come to mean. They made it illegal to publish images of violets for nearly 50 years. I find that worth pausing on. Not merely noting in passing, but actually pausing on. The French authorities looked at this plant, the one that grew in every hedgerow, the one that children played violet war with, the one that had been in cloister gardens and plague posies and poetry prizes and Shakespeare's plays and the graves of the English dead, and decided it was dangerous enough to prohibit, dangerous enough to keep off the printed page, dangerous enough that its image reproduced in ink was a thing that needed to be controlled. A flower. Banned. Because of what it meant to too many people. Because meaning, accumulated over enough time in enough minds, becomes a kind of power. And power, when it cannot be argued with directly, gets suppressed by whatever means are available. Napoleon was on St. Helena for 6 years before he died. He grew violets in his garden there, on a small island in the South Atlantic. At the furthest point from France that his captors could arrange, he grew the flower that had been Josephine's, and then his supporters, and then the symbol of a return that had not lasted. He grew them in the garden, because that is what you do with the plant you love. You put it in the ground, and you tend it, and you watch it come back in spring, as it always has, and as it always will, regardless of what is happening around it. When he died, in 1821, violets from that garden were placed in his coffin. The locket with Josephine's violets, the garden on St. Helena, the flowers placed with him at the end. A man who had held most of Europe in his hands, and lost it, keeping faith with a small purple flower through all of it. Through the campaigns, and the defeats, and the exile, and the final island, and the death that came eventually, to everything, including him. The violet did not care about any of that. It grew in the garden on St. Helena, the same way it had grown in Josephine's garden at Malmaison, the same way it grew in the hedgerows of England and the cloister walks of medieval monasteries, and the fields of ancient Greece where someone first looked at it and decided it meant something. It just grew. It just came back in spring. It just continued being what it had always been while the history moved around it and through it and attached itself to it and moved on. That is what plants do. It is one of the things I have always found most steadying about them. The scent of Viola odorata is unlike almost anything else in nature. This is not sentiment. It is chemistry, though. The chemistry took a long time to explain what people had been noticing for centuries. The scent is extraordinary. Sweet and deep and cool all at once, present one moment and then gone. Not faded, gone. You lean in again and find it, and then it disappears again and you lean in again. This is not your nose failing you. It is the flower doing something genuinely unusual. The principal scent compound in Viola odorata is ionone, and ionone has a particular property. It temporarily binds to the olfactory receptors responsible for detecting it, which means it effectively switches off your ability to smell it for a moment after you have smelled it. The scent desensitizes the very mechanism by which you perceive it, and then the receptors reset and you smell it again, and the whole cycle begins again. The violet that seems to hide from you is not hiding. It is simply more interesting than your nose can continuously process. People have been trying to capture that scent for a very long time, long enough that the plant acquired an entire secondary identity alongside its botanical and medicinal one. Viola odorata, sweet violet, wood violet, English violet, common violet, florist's violet, garden violet, the names accumulating as always around a plant. People could not leave alone. Was valued historically as much for its perfume as for anything else it offered. The scent and the medicine were not separate categories. Both were reasons to grow it, to harvest it, to keep it close. In the early 20th century, true violet flower extract entered commercial perfumery in earnest. The flowers themselves, vast quantities of them, grown specifically for the purpose in fields in the south of France and elsewhere, processed into an extract that carried the real scent, not an approximation, not a reconstruction. The actual ionone-rich material from the actual petals of the actual plant. It was expensive. It was labor-intensive beyond what most commercial operations found sustainable. The flowers were delicate, and the extraction was exacting, and the yields were not large. You needed an enormous weight of flowers to produce a small quantity of usable extract, and all of that cost had to be carried by a product that then had to find buyers willing to pay what it cost. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, true violet flower extract had almost disappeared from commercial perfume production entirely. Not because the desire for the scent had gone, the desire had not gone. But synthetic ionone, produced in a laboratory, stable, consistent, available in quantities no flower field could match, at a cost no flower field could compete with, had replaced it. The smell of violet in modern perfumery is almost entirely constructed from compounds that were never in a flower. They are accurate, they are convincing, they are indistinguishable to most noses from the real thing. And yet something did not entirely leave. The leaf remained, violet leaf absolute, extracted from the leaves rather than the flowers, is still used in modern perfumery, has continued to be used, has found its place in the vocabulary of the perfumer's palette, as something distinct from the flower scent and valuable in its own right. Green, cool, slightly watery, the smell of the plant itself rather than the bloom. The thing underneath the sweetness, the ground note that the flower grows from. An apothecary understands the distinction between flower and leaf. They are not the same thing from the same plant. They have different properties, different applications, different characters. The flower is the part people celebrate. The leaf is the part that quietly does a great deal of the work. In perfumery as in medicine, the leaf endured when the flower became too costly to use as itself, still present, still contributing, still recognizably violet, but in a different register, closer to the earth, less immediately beautiful, more quietly useful. That, too, is a kind of faithfulness. Viola odorata has been a medicinal herb since the time of Hippocrates. That is not a small thing to say. Hippocrates is where Western medicine conventionally locates its beginning, the point at which observation began to be separated from superstition. The point at which someone started writing down what worked and what did not, and why, or at least the best approximation of why that the available understanding could provide, and the violet was already there. Already in use, already understood well enough to be worth recording. That is 2,500 years of documented medicinal use. Before the monasteries, before the herbals, before Gerard and Culpeper and all the names that come to mind when people think of the history of botanical medicine in England, before all of it, Hippocrates knew the violet, knew it well enough to include it, knew it well enough that whoever came after him, working from his records, would find it there and recognize it and continue using it because the records said it worked and their own experience confirmed what the records said. That is how knowledge of this kind survives. Not through one person's genius, through the accumulation of many people's careful observations. Each one adding something to what the last one left behind, each one trusting the record enough to begin there and then going further. The violet has been in that record from very near the beginning. Viola tricolor followed a similar path, cultivated as an ornamental and as a medicinal plant since the Middle Ages, not discovered in the Middle Ages, not new to medicine then, but brought into cultivation, moved from the field margins and the disturbed ground where it grew wild into the managed spaces of gardens and physic gardens and the plots of people who grew plants with intention, who decided this one was worth the effort of tending rather than simply gathering, who made a choice to bring it closer, to keep it where they could see it and use it without having to go looking for it in the places it had chosen for itself. The original pansy is a European native, not a product of modern horticulture, not something that was designed in the 19th century and then sent out into the world as a finished article. The wild viola tricolor existed long before anyone began crossing it with anything. It grew in fields and roadsides and thin upland soils across Europe, and had been doing so for longer than any of the records that describe it. The records are themselves ancient. The plant is older than the records by a considerable margin. What the 19th century did was take that native plant and begin, with considerable enthusiasm and the particular energy that the British horticultural world applied to these projects, to make it into something else, something larger, something more varied in its colors, something that could fill a garden bed in a way the modest wild heartsease, with its small three-colored face and its preference for thin, unpromising ground, had never been designed to do. But before that, before the breeding programs and the nursery catalogues and the show benches, there was Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth embroidered viola tricolor onto gifts, wove it into her dresses, the flower that had been heartsease and herb trinity and pensondy and love in idleness. That flower, in its wild three-colored form, chosen by the most powerful woman in England as a motif worth putting on her body, worth carrying into her official portrait and her official gifts and her official presence in the world. She was not a person who chose things carelessly. Everything about Elizabeth's public presentation was deliberate and considered and communicative in ways that her court and her subjects were meant to read. The flower she chose to embroider on her dresses was not a casual aesthetic preference. It carried the weight of everything the flower had always meant: thought, constancy, the Trinity, heartsease, the flower of Shakespeare's world, and Shakespeare was writing in her reign, for her court, for the culture she had created around her. The love in idleness of a midsummer night's dream was performing in a world where the Queen herself wore the same flower on her sleeve. That is a particular kind of statement, the wildflower on the dresses of the Queen, the field plant elevated, not by being changed into something grander, but by being chosen as it was, in its own form, by someone who could have chosen anything. British breeding of viola tricolor began in earnest around 1810, which places it firmly in the period of the great horticultural enthusiasm that the 19th century brought to almost everything it touched, the period in which plant hunters were ranging across the world and bringing back specimens, and the nursery trade was expanding, and the show bench was becoming a serious competitive arena, and the question of what a flower could be made into with enough skill and patience and deliberate crossing was occupying a great many minds with a kind of focused intensity that only becomes possible when other things are going well enough to leave room for it. Lady Mary Elizabeth Bennet was one of the first. She collected every variety of viola tricolour she could find, every form of heartsease available to her in her father's Surrey garden in the early years of the 19th century. This was not passive appreciation. This was systematic collection, the kind of attention that precedes serious horticultural work. You gather everything that exists before you begin selecting for what you want to exist. You learn the range before you start working within it. Lady Bennet was building the foundation that the subsequent breeding would stand on, even if that was not quite how she would have described what she was doing on an ordinary morning in a Surrey garden. At roughly the same time, Lord Gambier was cultivating heartsease at Ivor, under the guidance of his gardener William Thompson. Thompson, as gardeners often do, was doing much of the actual work of selection and crossing. The names that get into the histories are often the aristocratic ones, the people with the land and the resources. But the knowledge was in the gardener's hands. Thompson understood what he was working with. He had the daily contact with the plants, the season-by-season observation of what the crossings produced, the accumulated practical understanding that comes from being in the garden in all weathers rather than visiting it on pleasant afternoons. The combination of an aristocratic patron with the resources and a skilled gardener with the knowledge produced, as it often did in that period, something worth recording. The heartsease at Ivor became notable. People noticed what Thompson was doing with it. The plants that came out of that garden were talked about and sought after and used as the basis for further work by people who had seen what careful selection could achieve. The crosses that defined what the garden pansy became involved viola tricolour, the wild European heartsease and Viola lutea, the mountain pansy of upland Britain and Europe, and Viola altaica, which came from the Altai mountains of Central Asia. 3 species brought together. The hybrid that emerged from these crossings is known formally as Viola Whittrockiana, the garden pansy. The large-flowered, broad, petaled, richly coloured plant that fills garden centres every spring and covers municipal plantings in patterns that the wild heartsease, with its modest 3-coloured face, would not quite recognize as a relative. And yet the face is still there in every garden pansy that was ever bred. However large the flower, however saturated the colour, however far from the original field plant the breeding has taken it, the face remains, the dark radiating lines. The expression of quiet consideration, the thing people have always seen looking back at them, that could not be bred out, or perhaps no one tried very hard to breed it out, because it was the thing people had always loved most, the thing that had given the flower its name and its history and its centuries of accumulated meaning. You cannot breed that out without losing the reason anyone wanted the flower in the first place. James Grieve worked in Edinburgh, breeding what he called tufted violas, smaller than the full pansy. Flowers held up cleanly above mats of foliage, plants suited to bedding in the Scottish climate, and the particular demands of the show bench and the garden beds of people who wanted something more refined than the exuberance of the large-flowered hybrids. Grieve was working in a different direction from some of his contemporaries toward neatness, toward a particular kind of contained elegance, the viola as a disciplined thing rather than an expansive one. Smaller flowers, cleaner lines, the face present, but not overwhelming. A different answer to the question of what the plant could become. John Salter was selling what he called Belgian pansies from his Versailles nursery in Hammersmith by 1851. The name is interesting. Belgian pansies had a reputation in the mid-19th century for a particular quality of flower, blotched, richly marked with the dark central markings that gave the face its definition and depth. The kind of flower that looked more than any other variety like the face that people had always seen in the petals. Salter was bringing that tradition into the London market. His nursery managed to combine a French name with a London address and a Belgian product, which tells you something about the internationalism of the Victorian nursery trade and its relatively relaxed attitude toward geographical consistency in its marketing. All of this breeding activity, the Surrey Garden, the Ivor Estate, the Edinburgh nurseries, the Hammersmith Versailles, was producing something that the original wild heartsease had never been. A fashionable flower, a competitive flower, a flower with a show bench culture around it and a dedicated community of growers comparing notes and exchanging seed and arguing. With the particular intensity that specialist enthusiasts bring to these questions, about what constituted the ideal form, what the perfect blotch should look like, what the ideal proportion of petal to marking was, what distinguished a first-class flower from a very good one. The plant that had grown in field margins for millennia and been used in medicine since Hippocrates and carried the accumulated symbolism of a dozen cultures and been worn by a queen and placed in a locket by an emperor. That plant was now being shown at competitive exhibitions by enthusiasts who had very specific opinions about blotch patterns, who had spent years developing those opinions through careful observation and were prepared to defend them. Both things are true. Both are part of what the viola is. The wild heartsease and the show pansy, the Hippocratic medicine, and the Victorian bedding scheme, the pansy and the Belgian nursery catalogue. They are not contradictions. They are the same plant at different points in the long conversation it has been having with human beings since before the conversation was written down. Each generation finding in it what they needed. Each one adding to what the plant meant without erasing what it had meant before. The International Herb Association named Pansy and Violet its Herb of the Year for 2022. Outstanding, they said, in decorative, culinary, and medicinal categories. 3 categories, 3 colors in the petals of Viola tricolor. 3 persons in the Trinity that the monks read into those colors. 3 things the flower has always been at once, without any of them diminishing the others. Herb of the Year, for a plant that has been an herb of every year since Hippocrates first wrote it down, that has been in the gardens and the herbals and the physic plots and the kitchen preparations and the apothecary jars and the show benches and the Surrey collections and the Edinburgh nurseries and the lockets of emperors and the dresses of queens without interruption across 2,500 years of recorded use, and longer still before the recording began. That is a long wait for formal recognition. But the viola, as we have established, is patient. It always has been. The line between food and medicine has never been as firm as we sometimes pretend. Not in this shop. The plants in these jars do not observe that distinction. They do what they do, whether you call it nourishment or remedy, depends on why you reached for them. The viola is a clear example of this. It has been eaten, drunk, preserved, candied, and syruped across 2,000 years of recorded culinary history. And while people were doing all of that, it was also doing what it always does to a body that takes it in. The ancient Greeks put violet petals in their wine, which tells you 2 things: that they had access to enough violets to use them liberally, and that they considered the flavor worth adding to something they already valued. Wine was not casual. It was central to Greek social life, to hospitality, to the rituals of the symposium. Putting something in it was a considered choice. The petals add a subtle flavor, floral without being cloying, present without overwhelming, the kind of note that makes a thing taste like it came from somewhere specific. By the 14th century, the flower was appearing in desserts, a preparation of rice pudding, almonds, and cream, violet petals worked into it. The combination is extraordinary when you think about it. The cool creaminess of the pudding, the weight of the almond, and the violet giving something the other ingredients could not provide alone. It was not a simple dish. Rice and almonds and cream together in the 14th century meant tables that could afford it. The violet was not included because it was cheap. It was included because it was good. Violet sugar was King Edward's favorite. The preparation is almost insultingly simple. You layer violet flowers in jars of castor sugar. You leave them. The sugar draws moisture from the petals. The scent and flavor transfer into it. What you end up with is something that tastes faintly of violet, without any fuss of extraction or distillation, the plant doing the work quietly, as it tends to. That a king had a favorite sugar of this kind tells you something. The medieval court expected flavor of a specific and considered kind, not merely richness, not merely sustenance. The violet sugar was not medicine dressed as food. It was a pleasure, one that happened to come from a plant with a long medicinal history. The two things sitting comfortably alongside each other, as they always have with this flower. The Tudor recipe books gave the viola considerable attention. The flowers were recommended for candying, for conserves, for syrups, for preparations that sat at the edge of kitchen and still room, at the edge of food and medicine. Those were exactly the preparations a Tudor household valued most. Made in late spring when violets were abundant, put up in jars, drawn on through the year when fresh flowers were not available. Candied violets are still made. The process has not changed significantly. You coat each flower carefully in egg white, dust it with sugar, leave it to dry. What you get is a flower preserved in its own form. The color fixed, the shape held, the flavor present in the sugar surrounding it. Set on a cake or floated on a dessert, it is unmistakably itself. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. In France, the viola found its way into meat dishes, particularly veal. The leaves and flowers used for a subtle green flavor they contribute. Not a dominant note, a background quality, the kind of ingredient you would notice if it were absent, even if you could not name it when it was present. The French also developed violet syrup into something of a national speciality. Crème de violet, a liqueur, and flavoring made from violet flowers, used in confectionery, used in cocktails. The violet's flavor concentrated and preserved and made portable, made usable across seasons, across the full range of things a kitchen might want to do with it. There is a nutritional matter worth recording here, one that would have surprised no one who used this plant regularly, but that modern analysis has confirmed with precision. Violet leaves and flowers are rich in vitamins A and C. Meaningfully rich. 2 violet leaves are sufficient to meet a person's daily requirement for vitamin C. 2 leaves. From a plant that grows in every hedgerow, that people have been pulling from their gardens for decades without a second thought. The people who ate violet leaves in spring salads, who put flowers in their wine and puddings and sugars, they were not merely enjoying a flavor. They were feeding themselves something their bodies needed, particularly at the end of winter, when stored food had given them little of either vitamin for months. The viola arriving in early spring was offering exactly what that moment required. It has always known what it was doing, even when the people eating it did not have the words for why it helped. This flower has been medicine for a very long time, longer than the monasteries, longer than the English herbals, longer than the names most people associate with the history of plant medicine in the Western world. Dioscorides wrote about violet in the 1st century. He described it as cooling, as soothing, as a plant whose nature was to reduce heat and calm what had become agitated or inflamed. That was his framework, cooling and heating the balance of qualities in a body that had tipped too far in one direction. The framework is not ours, but the observation was sound. He was not alone. Galen came after him. Pliny wrote about violet extensively. The Ayurvedic tradition used it. The Unani tradition used it. The Greco-Arab physicians used it. The Persian medical texts referenced it. These are not related traditions borrowing from each other. They are independent systems arriving at similar conclusions through observation. When that happens with a plant, it is worth paying attention to. The use is clustered around certain complaints: respiratory troubles, nervous system complaints, inflammation, the head, the heart, the lungs. These were the territories where violet was consistently reached for across traditions that had no direct knowledge of each other. That is not coincidence. Let us begin with the head, because that is where a great many of the classical uses are concentrated. Ancient sources used violet for heartburn, for inflammations of the skin and eyes, for what they called matters of the head, headaches. Watering eye is the kind of persistent complaint that sits above the shoulders and will not be shifted by ordinary means. A violet poultice applied to the forehead for headaches. That is a specific instruction, not a vague recommendation. Someone had tried it, had found it helped, had written it down so that others could find it when they needed it. Pliny went further. He recommended wearing violets above the head to ward off headaches and dizziness. A garland of violets on the brow. Not a poultice, not a tea. A garland worn. The plant kept close to the place it was meant to help. He also noted something specific about wine fumes. A violet garland worn on the head could dispel them, could prevent the headache that followed drinking too much. Whether this was the cooling nature of the plant acting on the heat of the wine, whether it was the scent doing something to the air around the head, whether it was something else entirely that Pliny's framework could not account for. He did not fully explain. He recorded what he had observed or been told. That was his method. It is, in its way, the same method we use now. Observation first, explanation after. Sometimes the explanation takes a very long time to arrive. The Athenian herbal practice recorded something else about pansy specifically, that it moderated anger, that it procured sleep. Two distinct actions noted together: the calming of what had become too heated, the bringing of rest to what had been unable to rest. Those two things are often connected. Anger that will not settle becomes sleeplessness. Sleeplessness that persists becomes a kind of anger. The plant that addresses one often addresses the other. The Athenians noticed this, filed it under pansy, passed it forward. The classical Greek remedies also recorded that violets comforted and strengthened the heart, not the physical heart specifically. The heart as a center, as the seat of something important that could be weakened or disturbed and needed supporting. Heartsease. The English name arriving at the same place by a different route. The Greeks and the English separated by centuries and language, and an entirely different understanding of how the body worked, both reaching for the same plant, for the same reason. That is the thing about a plant that genuinely works. It keeps being found. Galen wrote about melancholy. He was precise about it. Anyone oppressed by melancholy, he said, should cook violets in pure wine, as a remedy for lungs harmed by a discontented mind. That instruction contains several things worth unpacking. The first is that Galen understood the connection between the mind and the lungs. That a mind in sustained distress could harm the body's capacity to breathe, to process air, to do what lungs are supposed to do without effort. We understand this now through different mechanisms, through the language of stress and inflammation. But the connection Galen was drawing was real. He had observed it. He wrote it down specifically. The second is that his remedy was violet cooked in wine, the cooling plant, the plant of the head and the heart. Both the plant and the vehicle understood to have properties worth combining. And the third is that word, melancholy. In the Galenic framework, melancholy was not simply sadness. It was a constitutional state, a heaviness that settled into the body and the mind together and resisted ordinary intervention. It was what the Persians would later address with bitter root preparations for the spleen, what the English would call heartsease, what the Athenians had noted pansy could moderate. Different words, different frameworks, the same persistent human experience of a heaviness that will not lift, and the same plant reached for across all of them. Galen also referenced purple pansies for scrofula, the swellings of the neck that indicated tubercular infection, a specific application for a specific and visible condition. Not a general tonic use, a targeted one, the kind of reference that suggests someone had tried it in that context and found reason to record it. Pliny recorded the root in a different preparation entirely, a liniment of violet root with vinegar used for gout, used for disorders of the spleen. The root, rather than the flower, the vinegar as a vehicle, a rubbing preparation rather than something drunk. Different part of the plant, different preparation method, different condition, but the same underlying understanding that this plant had something to offer across a range of complaints. Pliny also recorded something that sits at the edge of medicine. In folk belief, he linked the violet with protection against spells, against epilepsy. The two things appearing together in a way that tells you something about where the boundary between medicine and magic sat in his world. It was not where we would put it. Epilepsy in the ancient world was understood differently. It was the sacred disease, the one that came from outside the ordinary workings of the body, that arrived without warning and overtook a person completely. Whether the violet was genuinely useful for seizures, or whether its protective reputation was entirely symbolic, is something the ancient sources cannot fully answer. What they can tell you is that the plant was trusted enough to be reached for even in the most frightening situations, even when ordinary medicine felt insufficient. That is a particular kind of trust, the kind that accumulates slowly over many uses, over many generations of someone reaching for a plant and finding it worth reaching for again. The violet seed had its own applications, used historically to treat the sting of scorpions, an internal use that carried a caution alongside it, that internally the seed might also act as an emetic. The same material doing two different things depending on dose and context. An apothecary learns early that this is not unusual. The same plant doing opposite things at different doses is not a contradiction, it is information. It tells you where the line is, it tells you to be precise. The scorpion sting remedy tells you something else as well, that the violet was not only a gentle plant for gentle complaints, not only the flower of thought and remembrance, not only the cooling remedy for headaches and wine fumes. It was also reached for in emergencies when something had gone wrong and the violet was what was available. That is a plant that had made itself genuinely useful, not ornamentally, not symbolically useful in the way that matters most. The classical sources agreed on certain patterns of preparation. The flower for internal use, steeped or cooked into wine or water, drunk warm for the head, for the lungs, for the heaviness of mood. The root for external use, ground and combined with vinegar or oil applied to swollen joints, to the inflammation of gout, to the tender places where the body had concentrated its complaint. The leaves as poultice, crushed and applied directly to the forehead for headache, to the skin for inflammation, to the eyes for redness and irritation, and the watering that comes when eyes have been asked to do too much. 3 parts of the plant, 3 methods of preparation, 3 categories of complaint organized by people who had no contact with each other, working in different languages and different centuries, arriving at the same divisions. That kind of convergence is not nothing. It is the closest thing to proof that a pre-scientific tradition can offer, not a controlled trial, not a mechanism identified and verified, but independent minds working independently and finding the same answer. The traditions that used it most extensively were sophisticated medical systems, built on long observation and careful transmission of what had been learned, and all of them used Viola for respiratory complaints, for nervous system troubles, for the overlap between the two that anyone watching a person struggle to breathe through sustained anxiety will recognize immediately. The lungs and the mind, the heart and the head, the mood that cannot settle, and the body that reflects it. This is not a narrow range of application. This is the plant reaching into several of the most common categories of human suffering and offering something useful in each of them. The ancient traditions were not using violet occasionally, not reaching for it when nothing better was available. They were using it consistently, deliberately, across a range of complaints important enough to be taken seriously by serious medical systems. Dioscorides included it, Galen included it, Pliny included it. The Ayurvedic tradition included it. The Persian physicians included it. That is not a list of people who were easily impressed. That is a list of people who had access to a great deal of botanical material, who chose to write specifically about this one, who considered it worth the space on the page, worth the transmission, worth making sure that whoever came after them would know what it could do. They were right to think so. The knowledge passed forward into the monasteries, into the physic gardens, into the hands of the medieval herbalists, who copied the classical texts and added their own observations alongside them, into the Tudor still rooms, into the apothecary shops of subsequent centuries, into this jar, on this shelf. In this shop, a line of transmission running back to Dioscorus in the 1st century, possibly back to Hippocrates before him, held together across 2,000 years by the simple fact that the plant kept being useful, kept doing what the records said it would do, kept giving people reason to pass the knowledge forward. The viola is not a dramatic plant. It does not cure things suddenly. It does not produce the kind of result that makes a remedy famous overnight. It works in the register of the cooling and the calming, the gradual easing of what had become too agitated or too inflamed or too heavy, the slow return of something disrupted back toward the condition it was supposed to hold. That is a quieter kind of usefulness, less visible, less immediately impressive, but more durable. The plants that last in the record across 2,000 years are rarely the dramatic ones. They are the ones that keep being quietly right, the ones that people reach for again and again and find again and again that reaching for them was the correct decision. There is one more thing the classical sources recorded about violet that deserves its own moment. The preparation of violet for the chest, for coughs, for the congestion that settles after illness and will not clear, for the breathing that becomes effortful in the wrong season or in the wrong air. Soothing to the lungs. That phrase appears across multiple traditions, not in the same words, but the same meaning underneath them. The plant that cooled and moistened what had become too dry and irritated. That eased the passage of air through passages that had narrowed. This is where Galen's instruction about violet cooked in wine for the lungs becomes most legible. He was not speaking only of mood. He was speaking of the physical lungs, of their capacity to do their work, of the way that work becomes harder when the tissue is inflamed or dried or burdened by sustained distress. The violet addressing both at once, the mood and the breath together, because they were understood to be together, because in any tradition that has watched enough sick people, the connection between how a person feels and how a person breathes is not a theory. It is something you observe on a Tuesday afternoon in a room with a patient who cannot get enough air and cannot explain why. The violet was part of the answer to that, across traditions, across centuries, in preparations drunk, and preparations applied and preparations worn as a garland above the head. Always the same plant, always the same quality of cooling and calming and bringing back toward order what had moved too far from it. That is what I keep in this jar. That is what has always been kept in jars like this one. Not just the dried flowers and the chemistry inside them. The accumulated knowledge of every person who reached for this plant and found it worth reaching for and wrote it down so that the next person would know where to begin. That is what an apothecary jar contains. It always has been 2,000 years of people knowing where to begin. That is not nothing. That is everything, really. The viola has earned every year of it. Every single one of them. The chest was where the viola earned much of its clinical reputation, not the symbolic reputation. Not the love potions or the Trinity or the stepmother's petals. The working reputation, the one built by people who had sick patients in front of them and needed something that helped. For coughs, for colds, for bronchitis, for the whooping cough that exhausted children and terrified their parents, for the congestion that settled in after illness and refused to leave, for the breathing that became effortful and stayed that way through the long wet months of winter. That is where the Viola was consistently reached for, across traditions, across centuries, in preparation after preparation designed to address what the chest was doing when it was doing it wrong. The plant has a quality that explains much of this use. It is mucilaginous. That word is less elegant than most of the language that surrounds this flower, but it is the right word. The leaves and flowers produce a substance that is slippery, coating, soothing to irritated surfaces in the way that slippery things are soothing to irritated surfaces. When a throat is raw and a cough is dry and the tissue of the airways has been scraped by days of effort, a mucilaginous plant offers something other plants cannot. It coats, it calms, it gives the tissue a chance to recover. The Viola was also regarded as antitussive, cough-suppressing, not in the aggressive chemical sense of a modern preparation, gently taking the edge off the reflex that had become self-perpetuating, the cough that no longer served any purpose but could not stop because the irritation that started it was still there. Those two qualities together made violet syrup a standard preparation in a great many traditions for a very long time. The soothing and the cough-suppressing working at the same time. In the same cup, the syrup was made from the blossoms, the flowers steeped in hot water, left overnight, strained with honey or sugar, bottled and sealed and put away for the months when the flowers were gone and the coughs had arrived. The color of a good violet syrup is extraordinary, deep purple, almost jewel-like. A color that looks like it should be doing something significant just by existing in a bottle on a shelf. And it does. It sits there through autumn and winter, ready, waiting for the moment when someone in the house needs it. A spoonful for a child who has been coughing since Tuesday. A cup for the old man whose chest is heavy with the cold that settles on him every November. A preparation for the new mother whose throat is raw and who needs something gentle enough not to interfere with feeding. The syrup addresses all of them, not dramatically, just better. The cough a little less persistent, the chest a little clearer, the throat a little less raw. Better? Over 3 or 4 days, consistently. That is what kept the violet syrup in the still room. That is what kept it in the pharmacopoeia. That is what keeps the dried flowers in this jar. Not transformation, not drama, just better. Which, when you are the one coughing, is exactly what you need. And for children specifically, the early European tradition used violet syrup as a gentle laxative for infants and young children, the mildest possible intervention for the mildest possible complaint. Something that worked without distressing the small body it was given to. Something a mother could administer without fear. That matters. The plants that found their way into preparations for children were the ones that had demonstrated over many years of use that they were genuinely safe, that the margin between helpful and harmful was wide enough to trust. Violet syrup was not a desperate measure. It was the obvious first reach. That is a particular kind of trust, earned slowly, held carefully. The British Pharmacopoeia eventually listed violet leaf as an expectorant, that is a formal acknowledgement, not folk medicine, not tradition passed by word of mouth, an official document that trained pharmacists were expected to work from. An expectorant encourages the movement of mucus. It helps what has become stuck to become unstuck, to be coughed up and out, rather than sitting in the airways and wearing a person down over weeks of a bad winter. The British Pharmacopoeia does not list things casually. The inclusion of violet leaf represents the formal endpoint of a very long line of observation, from Dioscorides and Galen noting the cooling and soothing properties, through the Unani herbalists who valued it for bronchitis, through the Iranian traditional practitioners who used it for respiratory expectoration, through the generations of people who made violet syrup in their still rooms and gave it to their coughing children. All of that observation concentrated into a single pharmacopoeial entry. Expectorant, violet leaf, use accordingly. The Pharmacopoeia of Europe added its own entry. For anti-inflammatory effects on eczema, the inflamed surface that needed calming from outside the way, the inflamed lung needed calming from inside. The same quality, the same action, applied in a different direction. The Ayurvedic text noted it for skin diseases and burns. The Greco-Arab systems used it for skin issues, alongside the epilepsy applications. Pliny had also recorded the traditions arriving at the skin from different angles, but arriving there consistently. There is a logic to this. The lungs and the skin are both surfaces, both boundaries between the inside of the body and the outside world, both capable of becoming inflamed, both responsive to the cooling and soothing action of a mucilaginous plant. A plant that helps inflamed lung tissue, helps inflame skin. Not through magic, through the same underlying quality applied at a different location. Beyond the chest and the skin, there were other territories. Fevers, sore throats, the acute illnesses that came in winter and needed something to bring the heat down and ease the rawness. Violet was part of that response, cooling again. Soothing again, the same qualities meeting a different presentation of the same underlying problem. Insomnia and nervous complaints. The historical herbalists noted these specifically. The plant that moderated anger and procured sleep in the Athenian tradition was the same plant being reached for by European herbalists centuries later. For the person who could not rest, who lay awake with thoughts that would not quieten. Heartsease for melancholy, for heartache. The emotional and the physical complaint often presenting together, the viola addressing both without needing to choose between them. The diuretic use. Dried violets used to encourage the flow of urine, to reduce what had accumulated and was not moving alongside the expectorant use. Alongside the laxative use, this places the viola consistently in the category of plants that help the body clear itself, that supported the systems of elimination when those systems had become sluggish or overwhelmed. The use for menstrual complaints, to reduce excessive discharge, a specific gynecological application noted in the traditional texts. The same plant that moistened and soothed the dry, irritated lung could also, in appropriate preparation, help reduce what was flowing too freely elsewhere. That apparent contradiction is not unusual. A plant's qualities express themselves differently depending on the context they meet. The skill of the herbalist is in knowing which preparation, which dose, which context calls for which expression of the plant's range. The use for abscesses, for swollen lymph glands, for what the older tradition called blood purifying. The support of the body's own systems for identifying and eliminating what did not belong. The viola working at the level of the body's defensive response. This is where the flavonoid content becomes relevant. Viola tricolor contains high levels of flavonoids, especially in the flowers. Flavonoids are compounds with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. They strengthen blood vessel walls. They support the integrity of the tissues that line the circulatory system. The traditional herbalists did not know the word flavonoid. They did not know the mechanism, but they observed the outcomes. They noted that violet helped with cardiac conditions, with high blood pressure, with what they called hardening of the vessels. They noted that the plant strengthened something in the system that moved blood around the body. They were right. They were describing, in the language available to them, the effect of a plant with a high flavonoid content acting on the cardiovascular system, strengthening vessel walls, reducing inflammation, supporting the conditions they were treating. The observation preceded the explanation by centuries. The explanation confirmed what the observation had already established. That is how it tends to work with plants that have been used carefully for a long time. The use for the after effects of drinking, violet for the morning after, for the head and the stomach and the general complaint of a body that has processed more alcohol than was wise. The cooling and the clearing properties meeting a familiar human situation. The same garland that Pliny wore to dispel wine fumes translated into a morning preparation drunk rather than worn. The same plant. A different form, a different point in the same sequence of events. What strikes me, standing here with this jar in the quiet of the evening, is how complete the picture is, not just in breadth, chest, skin, head, heart, lymph, sleep, mood, bowel, bladder, but in depth. Each use is not a single entry in a single text. Each one recurs, each one appears in multiple traditions, multiple centuries, multiple forms of record. Each one was noted, passed forward, confirmed, and passed forward again. That is not a plant that happened to be available and was used because nothing better was to hand. That is a plant that was actively preferred, sought out, prepared carefully, and given deliberately because the people giving it had reason to believe it would help. They had good reason. The flavonoids explain part of it. The mucilaginous quality explains part of it. The antitussive and expectorant properties explain part of it. The mild sedative quality noted in the traditional texts explains part of it. But the full picture is larger than any single explanation. It is the sum of what the plant does across all of those territories, acting together in a body that is dealing with multiple complaints at once, which is how bodies tend to present, not with a single clean problem and nothing else, with a cough and a poor night's sleep, and a low mood and a skin that has been difficult all winter. The Viola addresses that kind of patient. The whole patient, not one complaint in isolation. That is why it kept being reached for. That is why it is still in this jar. That is why it was in every apothecary shop that preceded this one and will be in every apothecary shop that comes after it. Not because it is dramatic, not because it transforms anything overnight, because it quietly, consistently, across 2,000 years of recorded use, and longer still, before the recording began, helps. That is enough. That has always been enough. There is something worth saying about the violet syrup that goes beyond its preparation and its uses. It is one of the oldest continuous pharmaceutical preparations in European history, a preparation that appears in the classical texts, in the medieval herbals, in the Tudor recipe books, in the Georgian pharmacopoeias, in the Victorian dispensatories. The same preparation, the blossoms in hot water, the sweetening of the bottle on the shelf, across 1,500 years of recorded use with no significant interruption. Most preparations do not survive that long. They get replaced, better options arrive. The mechanisms get understood, and something more targeted gets developed. The old preparation gets left behind. The violet syrup was never left behind. It simply continued. Alongside newer preparations, alongside the expanding toolkit of professional pharmacy, it remained in the still rooms, remained in the dispensaries, remained in the pharmacopoeias, because it worked, because it continued to work, because nothing that came after it rendered it obsolete. That is a remarkable record for something made from flowers steeped in hot water and sweetened with honey. It speaks to a quality in the plant that is not reducible to any single compound or any single mechanism. The whole plant, prepared simply, doing something that the whole patient needs, soothing the irritated surface, calming the persistent reflex, easing the chest that has been working too hard for too long. Simply, without drama, without the need for anything more complicated than the flowers and the water and the time to let them steep. That simplicity is not a limitation. It is the point. The best preparations are often the ones that ask very little of the person making them and give a great deal to the person receiving them. The violet syrup has always been that. It still is. The jar on this shelf holds the dried flowers that will become next season's syrup. Come spring, when the blossoms are at their peak, they will be gathered on a dry morning and steeped and sweetened and bottled, put away for November. For the coughs that are already coming, as they always come, through every winter this shop has been open, and every winter before that. The Viola will be ready. It is always ready. It has been ready for a very long time. There is also the question of what the diuretic use tells us about how the plant was understood. A diuretic encourages the kidneys to release fluid, to clear what has accumulated. In the older medical frameworks, this was understood as part of the same family of actions as the expectorant use and the laxative use, the body clearing itself, the systems of elimination doing their work, the Viola supporting all of them, not targeting one organ, supporting the direction of travel the body was already trying to take. That is a different model from the modern pharmaceutical approach. We target, we identify the mechanism, and we address it precisely. The older tradition worked differently. It supported systems. It worked with the body's own processes rather than overriding them. The Viola fitted that model perfectly. It helped the chest clear. It helped the bowel move. It helped the kidneys release. It helped the skin resolve its complaints. All through the same underlying qualities, the cooling, the soothing, the mild stimulation of elimination. One plant. One set of underlying qualities applied across a range of systems that all needed the same kind of help. That is an elegant thing, more elegant perhaps than the targeted single mechanism approach that came after it. Not better necessarily, not more effective necessarily, but elegant and durable, and still sitting in a jar on a shelf in an apothecary shop on a quiet evening, exactly where it has always been, ready for whoever needs it next. There is a shelf near the back of this shop that holds preparations for the outside of a body. Most people think of herbs as things that are swallowed, teas, syrups, tinctures, powders measured into a cup. That is the most familiar form. But the older traditions were just as interested in what a plant could do when laid directly against the skin, pressed into a wound, wrapped around an inflamed joint, applied as a plaster to a place the body was struggling to resolve. The Viola belongs on both shelves. It always has. The external uses of violet are not marginal. They are well attested across multiple traditions and centuries of recorded practice. When a patient came in with a wound that would not heal, violet appears in the record with real consistency. When there was a sore that kept returning, when skin had become inflamed and would not settle. A poultice is a simple thing. Herb material laid against the skin and held in place. No extraction, no complicated processing. The plant's qualities applied directly to the surface that needs them. Violet was used in this form for wounds, for sores and for ulcers, for skin that was open or broken or persistently irritated. The same cooling quality that made it useful for inflamed airways made it useful for inflamed skin. The logic is consistent. The plant addresses irritation wherever it finds it. The method of delivery changes, the underlying action does not. Think about what a wound actually needs in the days after injury. It needs the surrounding inflammation, managed rather than amplified. It needs the surface kept calm. It needs to be allowed to do its work without further aggravation. A poultice of violet applied to such a wound offered those things. Cooling where there was heat, soothing where there was irritation. Sores and ulcers present a different challenge. These are not fresh injuries. They are persistent ones, tissue that has broken down and is struggling to repair itself. Painful, slow, wearing. The older herbalists understood that such conditions required patient, repeated treatment, not a single dramatic intervention. Consistent, gentle application over time. This is where the mucilaginous quality of violet becomes relevant. The plant has a softening, coating character. It would have provided some protection to the damaged surface, a small barrier against further irritation, something that allowed the skin to begin repairing itself without being constantly disturbed. But the external uses of violet extend into territory that might surprise a modern reader. There is a preparation recorded in the older texts of violet plaster used for anal prolapse. I mention this not to provoke amusement. I mention it because it tells you something important. It tells you that the people recording these preparations followed the plant's known qualities without squeamishness. to whatever part of the body required them. A prolapse presents as inflamed, vulnerable, exposed tissue. The logic of applying a cooling herb to that presentation follows directly from its use on wounds elsewhere. The herbalists did not consider certain complaints too undignified to treat. They followed the plant's qualities to wherever those qualities were needed. That is a form of thoroughness worth noting. Violet was also used traditionally for scrofula, a chronic condition involving swelling of the lymph nodes, particularly in the neck, a tuberculosis infection of the lymphatic tissue, widespread through medieval and early modern Europe. It presented as swollen, sometimes ulcerated masses beneath the skin, persistent, disfiguring, extremely difficult to treat. That violet appeared in the traditional response to scrofula tells you how seriously it was regarded as an external herb. These were not minor blemishes. These were significant and medically challenging presentations. For the inflamed, swollen, painful surface of such a complaint, a violet poultice applied with regularity would have offered real relief, managing the misery of the symptom, while the body attempted, however slowly, to manage the cause. Eye inflammation was another territory where violet was traditionally employed. The eye is a surface like any other. An inflamed eye, red, irritated, sensitive, responds to cooling and soothing treatment. The anti-inflammatory character of violet was applied as a gentle wash or compress. Cool water, in which violet had been steeped, laid against the closed lid. The same cooling action. A different surface, running through all of these external uses as a single consistent thread. The understanding that violet was a cooling herb, one that reduced heat in inflamed tissue rather than adding to it. In the classical and traditional frameworks, inflammation was understood as excess heat, a terminology that now sounds imprecise, but which mapped reasonably well onto what we would recognize as inflammatory presentations today. A cooling herb addressed that excess, brought the heated thing back toward equilibrium. Violet was identified this way across classical, medieval, and early modern traditions. Without significant disagreement, its character was settled early and not contested much as time passed. Pansy and violet were often treated as interchangeable for practical purposes, both cooling, both anti-inflammatory. The distinction between species mattered in some contexts and was set aside in others, depending on what was available. The plaster form deserves a separate word. A plaster, in the older pharmaceutical sense, had enough body to hold its shape when applied. Thicker than a simple poultice, intended to stay in place for longer. Making a violet plaster required preparation. The herb material combined with a fixing agent, fat or wax, or something resinous that gave it substance. This form was preferred for conditions requiring sustained contact. For chronic complaints that needed prolonged application, the plaster could be applied in the morning and left through the day, or applied at night and left through sleep. Longer exposure, more opportunity for the plant's qualities to do their work. The fact that violet appeared in this more labor-intensive form tells you something. Apothecaries did not formulate plasters with ingredients they were uncertain about. The plaster form was reserved for herbs whose external action had been demonstrated. Violet had earned that place. Stand at this bench on a winter afternoon and picture a patient with a wound that has been slow to close, a month of it. The surrounding skin red and reluctant, persistent, wearing quietly miserable. You reach for the viola, you prepare the poultice, you explain what it is. The patient goes home with instructions. They return a week later. The skin has settled, the redness has reduced. The wound is beginning to close as it always should have. Neither you nor the apothecaries who preceded you in this work know precisely which compound in the plant is responsible. But, they knew that viola reliably brings inflamed and troubled skin back toward resolution, that it does this gently, that it causes no harm in the doing. That knowledge, accumulated and passed forward across many centuries of careful observation, is sitting in the jar on the shelf behind me, exactly where it belongs. The viola has always occupied an unusual position in the herbal tradition. On one hand, it is gentle. Mild, a plant for children's coughs and winter syrups and skin that need soothing. On the other hand, the historical record places it squarely in the treatment of some of the most feared and socially fraught complaints a body could carry. That tension is worth sitting with for a moment. Before it was a medicine, or alongside being a medicine, violet was a love charm. The plant appears in folk traditions as something carried or given to influence affection, to draw someone toward you, to soften resistance, to create the conditions in which love might take hold where it had not been before. This is not unusual for a plant with such a strong association with the heart and with feeling. The step from heartsease, ease of the heart, to love charm, is not a long one. Both concern the heart's condition. Both concern what the heart is open to. But the love charm tradition, sitting beside the medical tradition, creates an interesting picture. The same plant, gathered in the same field, used in one household to soothe a child's cough, used in another to bring someone closer, the viola moving through both territories without apparent contradiction. People have always wanted their herbs to do more than one thing. Now, the venereal disease entries. Nicholas Culpeper recorded that a syrup made from violet flowers was used for venereal disease. He was not being fanciful. He was recording what was in active use in his time. The 17th century, a period when syphilis had been a presence in Europe for well over 100 years and remained one of the most serious and least tractable medical problems a practitioner could face. Gerard had made a similar claim 60 years earlier. In 1597, Gerard praised pansy tinctures specifically against what he called the French disease. French disease was the common English name for syphilis. The French called it the Italian disease. The Italians called it the French disease. The Spanish called it something else entirely. Nobody wanted to claim it. The naming tells you something about how it was received and feared and immediately assigned to whoever was considered the most plausible source of contagion. Gerard. His recommendation was not a casual aside. He was a serious and influential herbalist. His herbal of 1597 was one of the most substantial botanical works produced in England in that period. When he praised pansy tinctures against syphilis, practitioners read that and noted it, and some of them acted on it. Culpeper returned to this ground in the following century. He restated the use of pansy for venereal ulcers, and he gave a mechanism: blood cooling action. In the older medical framework, syphilis was understood partly as a disease of heated, corrupted blood, the lesions, the inflammation, the fever, all of it framed as excess heat in the blood requiring cooling and correction. Violet, established across centuries as a cooling herb, was therefore a logical candidate. If the problem was hot corrupted blood, and violet cooled the blood, then violet addressed the problem. The logic was internally consistent. It followed from a model of disease and remedy that the practitioners of that period accepted and worked within. Whether violet actually cleared syphilitic infection, which we now understand as bacterial, requiring antibiotics to resolve properly, is a separate question. Almost certainly, it did not cure in the modern sense. But the venereal ulcers, the inflamed, broken skin of advanced syphilitic presentation, the surface complaints that made the disease so visibly and physically miserable, for those, a cooling and anti-inflammatory herb applied to inflamed tissue would have offered the same relief it offered to wounds and sores of any other origin. The underlying cause was different. The surface presentation was not. The herbalists were treating what they could see and reach with what they had. That is not nothing. Then there is the entry that surprises most people when they first encounter it. Culpeper deemed heartsease excellent for convulsions in children. This sits in a different register from the wound treatments and the venereal preparations. Convulsions are a neurological event. Sudden, frightening, dangerous. A child in convulsion was one of the most alarming presentations a parent or practitioner could face. That Culpeper reached for heartsease in this context tells you something about how the plant's mild sedative quality was understood. The same gentle calming action noted for anxiety and troubled sleep was being applied here to the most extreme version of nervous system disturbance. We should be careful not to overclaim. Culpeper writing that heartsease was excellent for children's convulsions does not mean it reliably stopped seizures. It means he believed it helped. That belief likely reflected some observed cases where a child's episode was less prolonged or less frequent, or where the aftermath was calmer. The mild sedative quality of the plant was real. The flavonoids present in Viola have been studied for their effects on the nervous system. There is something there, modest but present. For a practitioner with very few options and a frightened family, modest was not nothing. It was something to offer, something to try, something that would not harm and might help. Culpeper cared about people who had little. He wrote for them deliberately. His recommendations were practical. Heartsease grew in fields and on roadsides. You did not need to purchase it. You did not need an apothecary with a well-stocked shop. You needed to know where to look and what to do once you had found it. The syrup entries bring us back onto more familiar ground. Heartsease syrup for coughs. Heartsease syrup for fevers. Both of these sit comfortably within what we have already established about the plant. The syrup for coughs is the violet syrup preparation, one of the oldest continuous pharmaceutical preparations in European history. As we noted when discussing the chest uses, the antitussive quality, the mucilaginous soothing of the irritated airway. The fever use is perhaps less obvious at first, but return to the cooling character, a plant consistently identified across classical and traditional medicine, as cooling was a natural candidate for fever management. Fever is excess heat. A cooling herb addresses excess heat. The logic holds, the same logic that put violet in wound poultices and venereal preparations and eye compresses put it into the cup of a feverish child. The same underlying character expressed through a different preparation, addressed to a different presentation. One plant, one consistent set of qualities, applied with patience and observation across an enormous range of human complaints. That is not a plant people were guessing about. That is a plant people understood, as well as they were able to understand anything, in the time they had with the tools available to them. The jar on the shelf holds that understanding quietly, as it always has. Everything we have discussed so far has moved within a particular tradition. Classical, medieval European, the English herbalists, Culpeper, and Gerard and the apothecary lineage that connects this shop to those texts through an unbroken chain of practice. That tradition is real and well documented and worth taking seriously. But it is not the whole picture. The viola is not a European plant in the sense of belonging exclusively to Europe. The genus is wide, the species are many, and wherever members of that genus have grown, people have looked at them carefully and found uses for them. Independent of one another, across thousands of miles and entirely separate medical traditions, reaching with striking consistency toward the same conclusions. That consistency is the thing worth holding on to as we move through this part of the story. In traditional Chinese medicine, violet is known as Ding. The name translates roughly as purple flower earth nail, a reference to the plant's low growth and the way it seems pinned to the ground, present but unassuming, easy to overlook until you know what you are looking at. In the Chinese system, Zihua Diding belongs to a specific category. Herbs that clear heat and relieve toxicity. That phrase carries precise meaning within the framework. Heat in this context refers to conditions presenting with inflammation, redness, swelling, infection. Toxicity refers to accumulations the body cannot clear on its own. Boils, carbuncles, snake bites, conditions where something has entered or developed that the body's own processes are failing to resolve. Sit with that for a moment. Boils, carbuncles, inflamed infected tissue that has come to a head and is causing significant local pain and systemic disturbance. Now return to what we established about the European tradition. Wounds, sores, ulcers, inflamed skin that will not settle. The presentations are different in their specifics. The underlying category is the same: inflamed tissue, heat that needs clearing, a body struggling to resolve something at its surface. Two traditions, separated by the full width of a continent. No meaningful exchange of botanical knowledge between them in the periods we are discussing, both reaching for the same plant and placing it in the same functional category. That is not coincidence. That is the plant, demonstrating its character consistently enough that careful observers in entirely different contexts arrived at the same understanding. There is a difference in method worth noting. In the Chinese tradition, the entire plant is used: flowers, leaves and roots, gathered, processed, and cut into pieces for preparation. The Western herbal tradition has generally worked with the flowers and leaves, the aerial parts, the roots left in the ground. Whether the root contains additional or different constituents that alter the plant's action is a question worth asking. The Chinese practitioners clearly believed it did. They went to the trouble of including it. That decision was not arbitrary. It reflected accumulated observation about what the whole plant accomplished compared to the partial plant. It is a reminder that our own tradition's choices about which parts to use were also choices, made at particular moments reflecting particular assumptions, not necessarily the only possible approach to the same plant. Now, the cancer entries, both Native American and Chinese medical traditions recorded the use of violet for cancer treatment and for shrinking tumors. I will not overstate this. These are traditional records, not clinical trials, not controlled studies. They are observations made by practitioners working within frameworks very different from modern oncology. But they are there, in both traditions, independently. The modern interest in Viola's flavonoid content, particularly the cyclotides, the unusual looped peptides found in some Viola species, has given researchers reason to look more closely at these traditional claims. Some Viola constituents have shown cytotoxic activity in laboratory settings against certain cell lines under certain conditions. This is early. It is preliminary. It does not amount to a treatment recommendation, but it means the traditional observations are not simply being dismissed. They are being taken seriously enough to investigate. And the initial investigations have not found nothing. That is where the matter stands. Worth noting, worth watching, not worth overclaiming. The Native American uses of violet cover familiar ground and some new territory. Viola sororia. The common blue violet has a long history in Native American use as food, as medicine, as a plant woven into daily life rather than reserved for exceptional circumstances. The poultice use for skin infections follows the pattern we have already established. Inflamed skin, a cooling herb applied directly. The same logic, a different continent, the same plant. The use as an analgesic is worth pausing on. A poultice applied not just to reduce inflammation, but to reduce pain. The two are related but not identical. An anti-inflammatory action will reduce some pain as a consequence. But the specific identification of violet as pain-relieving in the poultice context suggests something was being observed beyond simple inflammation reduction. The respiratory uses infusions and decoctions for breathing complaints, again tracked closely with the European tradition. The mucilaginous soothing of the airway, the loosening of congestion, the calming of persistent cough. On the other side of the continent, from the European practitioners, working from entirely different frameworks, reaching for the same plant when someone came in struggling to breathe. Constantine Samuel Rafinesque recorded some of this in the late 1820s. He was a naturalist and botanist working in America, observant, prolific, sometimes erratic, but in this case recording what he actually saw around him. He noted Viola sororia being used for coughs, sore throats, and constipation. Coughs and sore throats sit exactly where we would expect. The constipation use echoes the mild laxative action noted in the European tradition, the gentle stimulation of the bowel, the same underlying quality in a different species on a different continent, recorded by a careful observer who was simply writing down what he saw people doing. There is something grounding about Rafinesque's record. He was not working from ancient texts. He was not following a received tradition. He was watching, and what he watched confirmed, from a completely independent starting point, what the European apothecary tradition had been saying for centuries. Then there are the Persian herbalists. The early medieval Islamic world produced some of the most sophisticated medical scholarship of that period. Persian physicians working within and extending the classical Greek tradition, combining Galenic frameworks with extensive original observation, producing texts that would influence European medicine for centuries. Persian herbalists of that period employed pansy in compounded skin salves. The salve form is worth noting, a compounded preparation, violet combined with other ingredients, formulated with care, applied to the skin for conditions the practitioners judged it suited to address. This places violet firmly within the sophisticated pharmaceutical tradition of medieval Islamic medicine, not a folk remedy, not something gathered in a field and used without preparation, a formulated compound made by practitioners who took their craft seriously and whose texts were considered authoritative across a wide geographical range. Stand back for a moment and take in the full picture of this section. China, Native America, Persia, Europe, different continents, different centuries, different medical frameworks built on entirely different foundational assumptions about how the body works and what illness means. All of them finding the viola, all of them placing it in the same functional territory. Cooling, clearing, soothing inflamed surfaces, supporting the body's attempt to resolve what it is struggling with. A plant does not achieve that kind of reach through accident. It achieves it by being genuinely, reliably, observably useful. Useful enough that careful people in very different places, looking at it through very different eyes, kept arriving at the same conclusions. The jar on this shelf holds a plant that belongs to all of those traditions simultaneously, without contradiction, without any of them cancelling the others out. It belongs to all of them because it earned its place in all of them. One careful observation at a time. There is a particular kind of authority that accumulates slowly, not declared, not assumed, earned through years of observation, through the slow accumulation of cases, through watching what happens when a preparation is given and what happens when it is not, through writing it down, through other practitioners reading what was written and testing it against their own experience. The herbalists we are about to discuss built that kind of authority over centuries across different countries and different languages and different medical frameworks. What connects them is not that they agreed on everything. They did not. What connects them is that they all looked carefully at the viola and wrote down what they found. And what they found across 5 centuries of serious European botanical scholarship was remarkably consistent. We begin in the 12th century, with a woman who had no formal medical training and became one of the most significant medical writers of her age. Hildegard of Bingen. She was a Benedictine abbess, a mystic, a composer, a correspondent of popes and emperors, and a careful observer of the natural world and its relationship to human health. Hildegard wrote extensively about plants and their uses. Her medical writings, Physica in particular, drew on classical sources but also on her own observation and the practical knowledge accumulated within her community. The monastery was not separate from medicine in that period. It was often the center of it. She noted wild pansy in her writings in the context of respiratory complaints and humoral balance. Humoral balance was the operating framework of medieval medicine. The body understood as containing four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, whose relative balance determined health. Illness was imbalance. Treatment was the restoration of proper proportion. Within that framework, violet was consistently placed as a cooling and moistening herb, one that addressed excess heat and dryness, particularly in the respiratory system, where heat and dryness produced the dry, irritated, inflamed presentations that the plant was used to address. Hildegard's inclusion of wild pansy in this context placed it within the mainstream of learned medieval medicine, not a folk remedy, not something from the margins, a plant that a serious and respected medical writer in the 12th century considered worth recording. 4 centuries later, the German herbalists took up the same plant. Lonesrus, writing in 1564, mentioned wild pansy remedies for skin ailments the following year. Hieronymus Bock documented pansy for various skin conditions. Both were working within the tradition of the great German herbals. Substantial illustrated, practical works aimed at making botanical knowledge accessible to practitioners across a wide range. Bock in particular was important. His Kräuterbuch was one of the foundational works of German Renaissance botany. He was a careful observer. He distinguished between plants that other writers had confused. He was not simply copying what others had written. He was looking at the plant itself and describing what he found. That he documented pansy for skin conditions confirms that the external use was not a peripheral or disputed application. It was mainstream enough to appear in a major reference work produced by a serious and careful botanist. Matthiolus, Pietro Andrea Mattioli, was working in roughly the same period, born in 1501, writing through the middle of the 16th century. An Italian physician and botanist whose commentary on Dioscorides became one of the most widely read botanical works in Europe. Translated into multiple languages, reprinted repeatedly across more than a century, Matthiolus recorded pansy in his herbal compendia for dermatological use. The same territory as Bock and Lonesrus, the skin, the inflamed, irritated, troubled surface that needed cooling and resolution. When 3 major botanical writers working in 3 different countries in the same period all reach for the same plant in response to the same category of complaint, that convergence means something. These were not men copying one another uncritically. They were each working from their own sources, their own observations, their own clinical experience. The agreement represents independent confirmation of the same finding. There is also a reference to a practitioner named Andreas, recorded in a historical review by Madaus in 1938. Andreas practiced pansy medicine in medieval Europe. The detail is thin, but its inclusion in a serious 20th century review of the historical literature confirms that pansy was not a plant used only by the famous names. It was part of the working pharmacopoeia of practitioners whose names did not survive with the same clarity as Hildegard or Gerard. The popular use of wild pansy through the Middle Ages for scabs and itching tells the same story from the other direction. Not just the learned physicians, not just the authors of important herbals. The general population, people who grew up knowing what this plant was and what it was for, and where to find it when they needed it. Scabs and itching, unglamorous complaints, the persistent low-level skin irritation that makes daily life uncomfortable without constituting a medical emergency. The kind of thing you treat yourself if you know how, the kind of thing the local knowledge of your community equips you to address. Violet was that knowledge, in fields and roadsides across medieval Europe, in a plant anyone could identify and gather, available to the person who could not afford an apothecary and did not live near a monastery. The plant that covered the gap between formal medicine and nothing at all. Now we arrive at Gerard. John Gerard, surgeon, gardener, author of the Herbal, published in 1597, one of the most influential botanical works in the English language. Controversial in some of its sourcing, Gerard was accused, not without foundation, of lifting substantial material from an earlier translation without adequate credit. But the work endured, it was read, it was used. It shaped English botanical understanding for generations. Gerard's treatment of pansy is detailed and worth examining carefully, because he covers more ground than most. He prescribed pansy for inflamed lungs, the respiratory territory again. The hot, inflamed airway that needed cooling. A cooling herb applied to a hot complaint. The logic unchanged from Hildegard, writing 4 centuries earlier. He described pansy as useful for scabs and itching of the whole body. Not a localized complaint, the whole body, which suggests he had observed or recorded cases where a systemic skin presentation responded to violet treatment, applied widely to a widespread complaint. He recorded the use of pansy for ulcers, specifically noting that the strained infusion, the liquid pressed from a steep preparation, used as a compress, could heal ulcers. This is a precise observation, not just violet for ulcers in general, but a specific preparation, a specific method of application, producing a specific result. That level of specificity suggests someone who had actually done this, or who had reliable accounts from someone who had not a theoretical recommendation copied from a classical source, a practical instruction about method. The ointment preparation is one of Gerard's more vivid entries, pansy boiled in hog's lard. The resulting preparation applied for body-wide itching and scabs. Hog's lard was a standard carrier in the pharmacy of Gerard's period, fat that could be heated and combined with herb material and then cooled into a stable preparation. It absorbed into the skin. It carried the herb's constituents with it. It was practical, available, and effective as a base. The choice of violet as the active herb in such a preparation tells you Gerard considered it a serious external medicine, not a garnish, not an afterthought. The thing the preparation was designed to deliver, boiled in fat, applied to the skin, for a widespread and persistent skin complaint. That is a practitioner's recommendation, specific about preparation and application and expected result. Then, there is the entry for infant spasms. Gerard prescribed pansy tea for infant spasms and chest inflammations. We encountered something similar when we discussed Culpeper on convulsions. Here it appears again, in Gerard a generation earlier. The mild calming action of the plant applied to the most alarming neurological presentations in the most vulnerable patients. Infant spasms, a parent's worst fear made manifest in a small body that cannot explain what is happening to it, and the practitioner reaching for the plant that gently, consistently, across its entire history of use, calms things. Whether it worked in the way Gerard hoped is a question we cannot fully answer from this distance. But the recommendation was not reckless. It was not a plant with known toxic effects being given to infants. It was a mild and gentle herb being offered in the hope that its calming quality would do something useful. The chest inflammation entry connects directly to the respiratory tradition. The inflamed airway, the hot lung, the same territory Hildegard had identified 4 centuries before, and the same territory the syrup makers had been addressing for longer than that. Gerard saw the plant whole. He used it for the chest, for the skin, for ulcers, for children's neurological disturbances, for the inflammatory complaints of the venereal tradition, for the bowel. That last entry deserves a moment. Gerard noted that violet leaves help make the belly soluble. His phrase, soluble in this context, means movable. Loose, the belly that is too bound being brought back toward easier function. The mild laxative action, appearing again in Gerard in the 1590s, confirming what the earlier tradition had noted and what later writers would continue to note, the same quality observed independently, passed forward. Stand back and look at what this section contains. Hildegard in the 12th century, Lonocerus in 1564, Bock in 1565, Matthiolus across the middle decades of the same century, Andreas somewhere in the medieval period before them, Gerard in 1597. 5 centuries, 4 countries, multiple languages, different medical frameworks, different relationships to the classical sources, all of them with the Viola in their texts, all of them placing it in the same territory. The skin, the chest, the bowel, the inflamed surface wherever it appeared. None of them working from a single shared source that could account for the agreement. Each of them drawing on a combination of received knowledge and their own observation. Each of them finding the Viola useful enough to record. When you read these names in sequence, you are not reading a tradition that invented a reputation for a plant and then repeated it uncritically for 500 years. You are reading a tradition that kept returning to the same plant because the same plant kept working. That is the distinction that matters. Repetition without observation is just copying. What these writers were doing was something else. They were confirming, each in their own time and place and practice, that the Viola did what the previous generation had said it did. It did. It does. The jar on this shelf is part of that same sequence. One more data point in a line that stretches from a Benedictine abbey in the 12th century to a quiet apothecary shop on an evening in this one. The plant has not changed. The finding has not changed. Only the centuries have changed, and they keep passing. It is one thing to know that a plant was used. It is another to know exactly how. The recipes matter. They are where the tradition becomes practical, where the knowledge moves from the page into the hands, where someone standing at a bench with herb material and a pot and a small fire has to make a series of decisions about what they are doing and why. Gerard and Culpeper both recorded specific preparations, not just recommendations, instructions. The kind of instructions that tell you someone had actually made these things and expected others to make them too. The ointment first, pansy flowers and leaves, fresh or dried, combined with hog's lard or sheep's suet, heated together until the fat has absorbed what the herb has to give, then strained, the plant material pressed out and removed, the fat retained, cooled into a stable preparation that will hold its character on the shelf until it is needed. Applied directly to inflamed skin, to scabs, to itching areas twice daily. The logic of the fat is carrier sound. Fat penetrates the skin. It carries with it whatever has been dissolved into it during the heating process. The mucilaginous quality of the violet, the salicylate compounds, the flavonoids that give the plant its anti-inflammatory character. Hog's lard was the most practical option available to Gerard's contemporaries, widely available. Stable enough to hold a preparation through weeks of use. Neutral enough not to interfere with the herb's action. Sheep's suet is harder, more waxy. It produces a firmer preparation. Better suited to applications where you want the ointment to stay where it is placed, rather than spreading. Both were in common use. The choice between them was a practical one, based on what the preparation needed to do. The wash preparation is simpler, but no less useful. The whole plant, flowers, leaves, stem, infused in hot water or white wine, steeped until the liquid has drawn out what the plant holds, then strained. The liquid used to rinse sores and ulcers, or soaked into a cloth and applied as a compress to affected skin. White wine as a solvent is interesting. Wine carries different constituents than water alone. Some of the plant's compounds that are less soluble in plain water will move more readily into a wine-based preparation. The older practitioners did not always know why this worked better for some herbs, but they had observed that it did. The compress method extends the contact time. You are not simply rinsing a surface. You are holding the preparation against it, allowing the cloth to deliver the liquid slowly and steadily, giving the skin time to receive what is being offered. The decoction poultice is the most involved of the three preparations. A handful of fresh pansy, a pint of water or milk simmered together until the liquid has reduced by half. The result is more concentrated than a simple infusion. More of what the plant holds has been drawn into the liquid under sustained heat. Milk as a base is worth noting. Milk has its own soothing and emollient properties, combined with the mucilaginous quality of the violet. A milk-based decoction applied as a poultice to inflamed tissue would have offered considerable comfort, the cloth soaked in warm liquid, held against the boil or the scrofulous swelling or the irritated eruption for 20 to 30 minutes. Warmth matters here, not hot enough to damage, warm enough to encourage circulation, to open the surface, to allow the preparation to do its work more effectively than it would against cold, contracted skin. The salicylates in violet are worth naming directly. Salicylates are the chemical family that includes the active compound in willow bark, the compound that eventually became aspirin. Anti-inflammatory, mildly analgesic, present in violet in modest amounts, working alongside the mucilage and the flavonoids to produce the composite action the plant was known and used for. The older practitioners did not know the word salicylate. They did not need to. They knew what the plant did when they used it correctly. The chemistry is the explanation for what they observed. It is not a correction of it. These three preparations, the ointment, the wash, the decoction poultice, cover the full range of external application: fat-based for sustained skin contact, water or wine, based for rinsing and compressing, milk, based and concentrated for drawing and soothing the most inflamed presentations. Different methods, different situations, the same plant at the center of all of them. That is what a well-understood herb looks like in practice. Not one preparation for one complaint, a range of preparations, each suited to what the situation requires, each drawing on the same underlying knowledge of what the plant does and why. The recipes survive because they worked, because someone made them and saw what happened and passed the method forward. That is how this shop came to have them. That is why they are still in use. And that, I think, is where we leave it for this evening. The viola, the plant that was never just a weed, that was never just a garden flower, that was never just the small overlooked thing growing at the edge of somewhere more important. It was Hildegard's respiratory herb in the 12th century. It was Gerard's ointment base in the 16th. It was Culpeper's syrup in the 17th. It was Zihua Diding clearing heat and toxicity in the Chinese tradition. It was the poultice in the Native American tradition. It was the Persian salve. It was the violet syrup on the shelf of every apothecary shop that ever took its work seriously. It was all of those things, simultaneously, without contradiction, and it is still in the jar on the third shelf of this shop, exactly where it has always been. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, names and folklore and chemistry and history and the quiet accumulated wisdom of people who looked carefully at a small flower and wrote down what they found. I hope some of it reached you, and I hope most of it did not. I hope you are, by now, somewhere considerably further from wakefulness than when we began, somewhere warm and quiet and sufficiently comfortable that the details of Viola's mucilaginous constituents have become a pleasant and distant hum rather than anything requiring attention. That is exactly where you should be. Thank you for spending your evening in this shop. It is always good to have company in the quiet hours. The candle is burning low now. The preparations are made. The jars are in their places. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are. The viola will be here when you wake up. It always is.